Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 426, Spy. When Toyn came in with a short prisoner, Rhaenys was sitting in a study in Dragonstone Castle, reading a book with great interest. This used to be Viserys' living room, and it still retains many of Viserys' things. After Stannis occupied Dragonstone, he did not clean up these books and handwritings, but left them here. Stannis also used this room as his study, and there were many traces of him left in it. Even in many books that Viserys read, there were Stannis comments under his notes and handwritings, including many words that Stannis could not understand. They were also marked, and the tone of the words showed deep doubts. Stannis did not recognize what these small square characters were, but he could guess that they might be words that expressed some meaning. He commissioned Maester Cresson, who followed him to Dragonstone, to study what these words were. Maester Cresson also took it very seriously and specifically drew these Chinese characters by copying them, but the drawings were a bit weird. Then he wrote a letter to the Citadel, asking for help to see if they could find some information. Maester Cresson's letter aroused widespread interest among the old scholars in the Citadel, because although they were well versed in ancient and modern times, they had never seen this kind of text. They could judge from some clues that these should be texts carrying some information. It even formed a unique landscape in the Citadel, where a group of grey-haired doctors and their apprentices were immersed in reading materials in the library. The Citadel has a large collection of books, and the doctors also have a desire for knowledge, but unfortunately, after searching through all the records, they did not find any records about this unique text. However, a record about the High Nobles of Illyria was found in a book, and the author of the book was more than 1,000 years ago. The origin of the High Nobles of Illyria is unknown. No one knows how this nation suddenly rose, and why they suddenly found a way to ride dragons. Moreover, this dragon controlling technique seems to exist only among the oldest nobles, whose blood can resonate with dragons. The author of this book speculates that there must be some unspeakable secret hidden among these High Nobles of Illyria, and this secret may be able to unlock the reason why they can control dragons. Therefore, a doctor boldly speculated, based on the records in this book, that this might be a unique way of communication between the oldest nobles of Illyria, a special kind of writing. He was willing to name it Morris language after himself, but unfortunately he was stopped by other doctors. And Stannis noted on Viserys' mysterious notes that it was suspected to be the writing of the ancestors. The girl with long brown hair wore a gorgeous white silk dress and a golden crown on her head. Bathed in the sunlight on the windowsill, she slightly raised her delicate chin and held the book in her white hands, reading it with relish. She had just finished some military affairs today, and another batch of food and supplies sailed from Pentos to Dragonstone. After the Targaryen army occupied Dragonstone, they did not immediately attack King's Landing because of the temporary cooperation against the White Walkers. But Rhaenys did not stop during this period, but worked non-stop to build a military transportation channel from Pentos to Dragonstone. Thanks to the frequent trade between the two places, this route is the most frequent trade route between Westeros and Essos, and it is not difficult to build a supply channel. Rhaenys also received a letter from her uncle today. The 2nd Legion led by a Baron has arrived at the port of Pentos, and is ready to board the ship, to leave Pentos and sail to Westeros. It may be on the way now. At this time, there was a hurried sound of footsteps outside the study in the castle. An unsullied soldier standing outside the study stopped them, and then pushed the door, and walked in to report. Your Highness. It turned out to be the leader of the Golden Group, Miss Toyn. The soldiers of the Golden Group caught 9 spies who were secretly approaching Dragonstone on a small boat on the beach of Dragonstone. They were wearing ragged clothes, which were soaked by the sea water. After they dried slightly, there was a thin layer of salt crystals on the clothes. They were all pale and thin, and their hair was messy like a bird's nest. The boat they were riding was too small, so they avoided the inspection of the Dragonstone fleet. However, they did not expect that when approaching Dragonstone, the boat accidentally hit a reef and leaked, and all the people on the boat were soaked in the sea water. Then they were forced to abandon the boat and jump into the sea to swim towards the coast, which was not far away. Fortunately, they were lucky and swam to the shore smoothly. They were only half dead on the beach. However, their good luck ran out. A patrolling team of Golden Group soldiers found them and took them to the leader. After that, Miss Toyn asked about their identities and took one of them to the castle of Dragonston to meet Her Royal Highness the Princess. Spy? The girl bathed in the sunlight on the windowsill put down the book in her hand slightly after hearing Miss Toyn's words and looked over with a pair of beautiful eyes. This is the second spy incident in recent times. Last time, a person who claimed to be a representative of the Lannister family wanted to persuade the Golden Company to betray the Targaryens. He directly detained Rhaenys as a hostage and threatened Viserys to withdraw. However, what the representative of the Lannister family did not know was that the Dragonston castle was heavily guarded and easy to defend, but difficult to attack. The 2,000 Unsullied were Princess Rhaenys' personal guards guarding various parts of the castle. It was almost impregnable. Even if 10,000 soldiers of the Golden Company betrayed, it would be difficult to storm the Dragonston castle. What's more, Rhaenys had the help of a dragon. Even if the war was not going well, she could ride on a dragon and escape at any time. Therefore, the conspiracy of the Lannister family was fundamentally impossible to achieve. And the spy brought by Miss Toyn in front of her. Rhaenys blinked her eyes. The other party was not tall and seemed to be only the size of a child. His legs were short and his face was not good looking. His two eyes were one black and one green. What was particularly eye-catching was that his head was somewhat disproportionately large. The brown-haired girl sat in her seat, the golden crown on her head reflecting light slightly, and then she couldn't help but blurt out, "Why is your head so big?" Chapter 427 Tyrion's Price. As soon as Rhaenys spoke, the person opposite her suddenly looked a little embarrassed. Then after Miss Toyn's explanation, she realized that the short dwarf in front of her was the notorious little devil of the Lannister family. It is said that the other party has visited all the brothels in the Seven Kingdoms. Of course, these rumors are exaggerated. But it is well known that the little devil Tyrion Lannister is not liked by people. Tyrion speaks harshly and mercilessly and likes to use the Lannister family to pressure others. This may be related to his unique growth environment, but the little devil's reputation is not very good, so much so that Miss Toyn has heard of his name. Rhaenys listened to Miss Toyn's explanation, and her beautiful eyes flashed slightly. Her seemingly quirky words just now were actually for other purposes. But when she heard that the other party was a Lannister, the girl's eyes suddenly became dangerous. Lannister's hands were stained with the blood of her relatives, and she knew this since she was very young. Although Rhaenys had forgotten what her father, mother, and brother looked like, she had not forgotten this hatred. Kill them. Rhaenys frowned slightly, and then she spoke directly without asking any more questions. However, Rhaenys' words scared Tyrion, who was standing opposite her, to death. He escaped from the cellar of Moat Cailin not to be sent to Dragonston and have his head chopped off with a click. In fact, if he had a choice, he would not want to follow those people here, but he had no say in that group of people. The other party wanted to find Viserys, so he had to follow them obediently to survive. However, Tyrion's eye-catching appearance is almost the most recognizable in the Seven Kingdoms. No matter where he goes, he will be picked out by people at the first time, and this time is no exception. Although Benjen, Aliza Thorne, and Yoren were also temporarily detained, they were also given good food and drink, changed clothes and took a bath. Only Tyrion was brought here, and the other party didn't say a few more words, and he was about to chop off his head with a light sentence. Your Highness. Your Highness. Please wait a moment. Hearing that Rhaenys was about to chop him off, Tyrion was terrified and couldn't help but yelling, "Princess, can you listen to me for a word? Just one word, and then you can behead or hang me as you wish." Tyrion's tone was urgent, and he racked his brains to survive. Rhaenys' slightly frowned brows did not relax when she heard his words, but she still nodded slightly and spoke softly. "Okay. It's understandable to let him say a word before he dies," but Rhaenys then added, "But Tyrion, remember, you only need one word to change my mind." Tyrion was relieved when he heard it. Although it was really just one word, as long as he could speak, he still had hope of surviving. Tyrion was most afraid of people who didn't say a word and came up with the clear purpose of killing him. For example, his biological father Tywin Lannister. The purpose was very clear. Without any warning or communication, Tyrion was captured alive and tied up in the cellar, hoping that he would die at the hands of the White Walkers. My biological father wanted to kill me, but failed. Tyrion thought for a moment, and finally thought of the most appropriate words, then took a deep breath and spoke. And his words really attracted Rhaenys' attention. The girl was ready to order him to be hanged after hearing his last words, but she didn't expect Tyrion to say such a sentence. She thought she would cry and beg for mercy, but Tyrion didn't do it. Why did your father want to kill you? Rhaenys couldn't help asking. Of course, she knew that the murderer of her relatives was not Tyrion, but his father Tywin Lannister. Tyrion was just a child at that time. When Tyrion heard Rhaenys continued to ask along with his topic, the uneasiness in his heart suddenly dissipated, and he completely relaxed. If Her Royal Highness was willing to listen, it meant there was a chance. Tyrion was very smart. When he was escorted here, he had already figured out who the big shot he was going to meet was. Tyrion himself was also very familiar with the Targaryen family on the other side of the Narrow Sea, because he once regarded the Targaryen family as the biggest opponent, and he knew that the other party would never let Lannister go. But now Tyrion realized how ridiculous his thoughts were at that time. The enemy who was least likely to let them go was willing to listen to his explanation, but his biological father tied him up without saying a word, trying to get rid of him with the help of the White Walkers, and even earn a little reputation with his corpse. Because I was born a damn dwarf, Tyrion answered decisively. I was born and killed my mother. I'm the shame of the family, and there may be more shitty reasons. The little devil had his hands tied tightly and took 2 steps in front of Rhaenys, but his eyes swept around. He didn't see his beloved wine, and he sighed with regret. There should be a pot of wine when talking about this topic. On the other side, the unsullied soldier standing in the study looked at Tyrion and spoke in a cold tone. Watch your tone when talking to Her Royal Highness. Understood. Tyrion immediately raised his bound hand slightly and shrugged at the unsullied soldier to show that he understood. My father wanted to feed me to the White Walkers for this reason, so that I could become a walking corpse. It not only avenged my mother, but also eradicated the shame that brought shame to the family. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. My father just likes to do things like this. If Her Royal Highness doesn't believe it, you can ask around. If I'm right, the news of my death has spread in many places across the 7 kingdoms. The heir of the Lannister family, the future Duke of Casterly Rock, a half-man who was only 3 or 4 feet tall, fought to the death on the battlefield of Moat Cailin and died heroically. The Lannister family is really full of loyal heroes, Tyrion said with a hint of sarcasm in his tone. When Rhaenys heard his words, she couldn't help but turn her head to look at Miss Toyne, and the leader of the Golden Company nodded slightly. When he first captured Tyrion, he still had some doubts, because the news of Tyrion's death had indeed spread throughout the 7 kingdoms, but he didn't expect that the other party was not dead, but was thrown to the battlefield by his biological father to die. Miss Toyne nodded slightly, and Rhaenys immediately understood, and retracted her gaze to Tyrion again. Your father's guilt really has little to do with you, but your father killed my family, and it is only right for me to kill his son. What do you want to buy your life back with? And Tyrion seemed to be prepared for this, so he spoke decisively. King's Landing. Your Highness, I'm willing to take King's Landing for you in exchange for my worthless life. Chapter 428, Ironhoof's Raging. In the year 293 of the Egan calendar, humans defeated the White Walkers and achieved a short-lived victory. However, the largest coalition in human history quickly fell apart after winning the war and began to fall into civil war. King Robert was shot in the battlefield and fell into a coma. The temporary commander of the coalition, Duke Tywin Lannister, the Guardian of the West, used a dishonorable method to fire crossbows at the reinforcement from Pentos, attempting to kill Viserys and his dragon. However, Tywin's conspiracy failed and instead aroused Viserys' anger. The Dothraki cavalry surrounded one side of the twins, vowing to kill all these treacherous people. The dragons spewed dragon flames and madly attacked the walls of the twins, causing heavy casualties among the coalition soldiers. It was not until the dragon flames burned the walls and blasted open the oak gates that the Dothraki cavalry rushed in with a piercing howl, and the coalition was forced to abandon the twins. They used wildfire to blow up the stone bridge across the river and the twins to stop the Dothraki from chasing them, and the army retreated towards Riverrun. The third battle of the twins came to an end. In the following wars, facing the flat riverlands, the Dothraki were unstoppable and chased the coalition forces all the way. The sea city along the way had long been empty because it had been attacked by the White Walkers, and towns such as Stone City all surrendered without any resistance and knelt directly to Viserys. Beauty Set was originally a rich and peaceful town located on the banks of the Blue Fork River. But because it had a wooden bridge that could cross the Blue Fork River, it was targeted by the Dothraki army, and the peaceful and comfortable life was instantly broken. In the morning sun. Tap tap tap. A Dothraki cavalry sentinel unit first appeared on the other side of the Blue Fork River. There were not many people, and the sound of horse hooves was chaotic and noisy. The Dothraki stopped on the other side of the river and reined in their horses, seemingly watching something, while speaking loudly in a language they could not understand. At this time, the people in the market had not received the news yet and did not understand what was going to happen next. They just thought that these people looked a little strange, with strange oil paint on their faces and bodies. Then more and more Dothraki began to appear on the other side of the Blue Fork River and gradually approached with fierce eyes. The residents living in the Beauty Set realized that something was wrong. Because it was not very close to the twins, the residents here had not retreated yet and knew very little about the news from the front line. The coalition took another road and fled to Riverrun in a hurry, and this town happened to appear on the Dothraki's pursuit route. The citizens and mercenaries in the town spontaneously organized a guard to resist the attack of the Dothraki, but the final result was just a mantis trying to stop a chariot. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki let out a sharp howl. Rumble. The sound of horses' hooves galloped across the wooden bridge and rushed into the beauty market, waving scimitars in their hands and easily harvesting the lives of these people. Stop them. Stop them. A retired old mercenary was selected from the guards of the beauty market to command the battle, but before he could say 2 words, he was hit in the throat accurately by an arrow. Puff. The old mercenary struggled twice while holding his throat, and his body fell from the simple wall of the village. The horses' hooves of the Dothraki trampled on the roads of this town. Facing this group of fierce grassland cavalry, the guards that the beauty market temporarily formed were as fragile as a piece of paper and were easily punctured. Merchants, farmers, mercenaries, etc. who came and went in the market were all fleeing, and heads rolled to the ground. It symbolized that this rich river town was officially broken by the Dothraki and turned into a hell on earth. In the chaos of the beauty market, bang, a closed door of a house was suddenly kicked open, and a woman's scream and her child's crying were heard from inside. The Dothraki warrior holding a scimitar heard the woman's scream and a ferocious smile appeared on his face. Then he strode towards the source of the sound and saw a mother and son shivering beside the bed. Hey, Os. He spoke in an incomprehensible Dothraki language, and the red-haired woman in the room held a dagger in her hand, pointing at the other party nervously, protecting her son behind her, and did not seem to be ready to sit and wait for death. Stop. What are you going to do? The woman held the dagger tightly and summoned up the courage to ask loudly. However, facing the sandal woman who tried to resist, the Dothraki warrior's grim smile did not fade at all, but took the initiative to open his arms to reveal the strong chest under the animal skin armor. He spoke in an incomprehensible Dothraki language and slowly approached the woman, even throwing away the bloody scimitar in his hand, leaving his bare hands. He had just used this knife to harvest the lives of 3 Endels. Stop. Stand still. The woman looked at the man approaching, and her expression became more nervous. She didn't know if the man understood what she said, but the dark brown-skinned and strong Dothraki man in front of her had no intention of stopping. The woman closed her eyes and mustered up her courage to stab the Dothraki's chest with a dagger, but the man dodged it easily. The grassland warrior grabbed the woman's wrist, twisted the dagger in his hand, tore the woman's clothes roughly, pressed her on the bed, and raped his mother in front of the child. A staggering knight who escaped from nowhere saw this scene, and he roared and rushed over. Die. While the other party was moving and defenseless, he stabbed the roaring warrior's chest from behind and killed him. Quick, follow me. The wandering knight pulled the woman and the child and fled outside. Unfortunately, the kind-hearted wandering knight had just escaped from the room with the mother and child when a Dothraki passing by on horseback cut his throat with a knife. Puff, blood sprayed on the ground. And such things continued to happen in various places in this town, and the whole beauty town became a living hell. The owner of an inn at the intersection was tied to a tree and hanged. His son tried to resist, but was easily killed by the Dothraki, who cut open his stomach and threw his body in the courtyard. The maid in the inn was unlucky and was carried away on her shoulders. In the eyes of the Dothraki, these were all their spoils of war. The chef of the inn was forced to make some food by himself to entertain these invaders who were a little tired after the fight. Hey. Ropes were accurately put around the neck of the statue of the father. The Dothraki shouted slogans and then worked together to drag down the statues of the 7 gods in the temple and smash them to pieces. If the Dothraki knew that it was not convenient to transport these statues from these Dothraki across the poisonous water, they would definitely bring the statues of the 7 gods back to the holy city. After the turmoil of the beauty set being breached, a ray of fire gradually illuminated and then turned into a blazing flame, the flame soaring into the sky. Chapter 429, Changing the Operational Plan. Half a day later, the figure of a giant dragon descended from the sky. Viserys went to chase the defeated coalition army and returned, but he did not expect such a thing to happen. Beauty Set was massacred by the Dothraki. Looking at the town that had turned into ruins in front of him, and even the unextinguished flames were rising with smoke, Viserys' face was a little ugly. Blood of my blood. As a blood guard of Viserys, Kago knew that something was wrong. He had lived in Volantis, Lies, Tirosh and other places for many years, and knew the rules of these civilized worlds. Although the massacre was commonplace for the Dothraki, it was a very serious incident for these people. Kago actually did not know about it in advance, otherwise he might have asked his compatriots to restrain themselves as much as possible. Kago's vanguard attacked the town on its own initiative, and when the large army led by Kago arrived, Beauty Set had already turned into ruins. But even if he didn't know about it beforehand, he, as the commander, couldn't escape the blame for what happened. So Kago tied his hands, took off his shirt, and knelt in the tent waiting for the trial of the Khal. Viserys lifted the curtain and walked in. He had already understood the whole story. Khal. The Dothraki standing on both sides were whispering, and when they saw their own Khal walking in, they quickly shut up. They didn't understand why Kago did this. In their opinion, slaughtering the city was a matter of course, and treating the enemy well was something they had never thought of. This was a reward for the warriors to participate in the war. After all, the Dothraki didn't have any rewards such as military pay. The burning, killing and looting after breaking the city was the only way to motivate the warriors to fight bravely. And they didn't kill everyone. The strong men were treated as slaves, and the women were taken away as trophies. As for children, the Dothraki also had their own rules. Children under the wheels would not be killed. But since Kago tied his hands and knelt on the ground waiting for punishment, the rest of the Dothraki were also watching how the Khal would deal with him. Viserys walked into the tent, took off his grey wolfskin cloak, and handed it to the guard beside him. He stood in front of Kago and was silent for a moment, but he did not punish Kago for justice. Instead, he stretched out his hand and took an axe scimitar from a Dothraki next to him, and then chopped it down, accurately passing through his hands and cutting the rope on Kago's hand. The action of the Khal immediately aroused cheers from the Dothraki present. Not only because the Khal forgave his blood guard, but also because of Viserys' superb martial arts. The Dothraki admired such a master. Get up, Kago. This is not your responsibility. It will not happen again. Viserys helped Kago up from the ground and patted the Dothraki on the shoulder, which made him feel terrified. In fact, this matter was not Kago's responsibility. This was the tradition of the Dothraki people, who burned, killed, and looted after breaking into the city. Viserys was more reflecting on his mistakes. The Dothraki under his command were so obedient that he forgot that this people on the grassland were very fierce, and even the destroyer of civilization on the continent of Essos. Although he could make the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms surrender through bloody conquest, Viserys did not want to harvest a devastated Westeros, otherwise it would be useless to have an Iron Throne. After slaughtering all the people in the Seven Kingdoms, Viserys comforted Cargo a little, and what he was thinking about was the next arrangement for the Dothraki. They should appear more on the battlefield instead of directly attacking the city, otherwise it would be a nightmare for the local people. This is a sharp double-edged sword. If used well, it is a nightmare for all enemies, and if used poorly, it may even hurt itself. However, Viserys only has the Dothraki in his hands, and he can only use them. The Targaryen army defeated the coalition forces at the Twins, and the coalition forces fled to Riverrun by using wildfire as a rear guard. Although Viserys was a full cavalry Lenup, the pursuit along the way was not very close. The main purpose was to recapture the towns along the way, and there was also a little consideration of Viserys himself, which was to gather more enemies and then kill them all at once. Viserys had just ridden a dragon to chase the coalition forces. From the sky, he saw that the coalition forces had now retreated to the direction of Raventree City, while the Dothraki army had reached the Fairyland. The distance between the two sides was not far apart. In fact, his original plan was to attack Westeros on two fronts with Rhaenys, one in the south and one in the north. He led the Dothraki people to mainly deal with the enemies in the north, while Rhaenys led the Golden Group and the Unsullied to cooperate with Dawn to attack the enemy's base camp, King's Landing, Storm's End, and even Highgarden. However, his plan was forced to change after receiving a letter last night. This letter came from Pentos and was written by his fiancée Arianne Martell. The Dawn Girl told Viserys in the letter that she was pregnant with his child. She didn't know whether it was a little prince or a little princess, but she liked both boys and girls. Now 2 months have passed. Viserys was slightly surprised when he received the letter. He did not expect that he would become a father. However, thinking about the days in Pentos, Arianne even took the initiative to send her friend Tyene to Viserys' bed. It was a good thing that Tyene did not give him a big gift. Although illegitimate children are a very common thing in this world, Viserys does not want to have an illegitimate child before there is an orthodox heir. The contraceptive measures in this world are very poor, so he deliberately paid some attention. However, although Arianne's pregnancy surprised Viserys, it was not difficult to accept. The tension and panic that ordinary people would have only lasted for a short time for him. Then Viserys calmed down, and the first thing he thought of was to adjust the battle plan. The previous two-front battle plan was temporarily shelved under this special situation. When Arianne wrote this letter, she was ready to take a ship to Westeros and follow her uncle Oberyn's army. And when Viserys received this letter, it was a long time. That night, the tent was brightly lit, and the fire was burning in the brazier. Viserys summoned the main generals of the Dothraki and Casco, and decided on the next battle route. First, capture Riverrun and defeat the main force of the coalition. Then take the river road, and meet up in King's Landing. A few days later, the coalition seemed to have an internal conflict. Some soldiers in the valley left the main force and went along the river road towards the kneeling stack. King Robert Baratheon, who had been in a coma for a month, finally woke up, and all the generals of the coalition sat around the king's bed. But at this time, a horn suddenly sounded outside the city of Riverrun. The endless Dothraki army appeared outside the city and surrounded Riverrun. Chapter 430, Siege of Riverrun. Robert never thought that more than a month had passed since he woke up, and he never thought that he was already in Riverrun. His thoughts were still on the scene more than a month ago when his lover, the woman he loved most in his life, shot an arrow at him. Robert didn't even know how to dodge at the time, but just sat on his warhorse in a daze, and then the ice arrow hit his right chest, and he fell to the ground. "I saw Lyanna, Eddard," Robert said abruptly, while lying on the hospital bed with a pale face. He saw many people standing around him, including his good brother Eddard, his brother Stannis, his father-in-law Tywin, and the Duke of Riverrun Hoster Tully and other high-ranking nobles of the Seven Kingdoms. The house was full of people, and some people were even standing outside the house. He thought that the White Walkers had wiped them out, and the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms had gathered in the Seven Hells. Robert's sudden words at this time made Eddard Stark, who was looking worried, slightly stunned. "What are you talking about, Robert?" The coalition repelled the White Walkers, but suffered a tragic defeat in the Battle of the Twins, lost most of the Riverlands, and retreated to Riverrun in a panic. Edward's face was naturally full of sorrow. But when he heard what Robert suddenly said, Edward was stunned for a moment, then looked up at Robert, and found that Robert, who was known as the true Steel among the three Baratheon brothers, had burst into tears. Tywin Lannister, who was standing behind Stannis, heard his son-in-law's words and his face was slightly ugly. Who is Lyanna? Many nobles present knew that Miss Lyanna Stark, who had the blood of the wolf, was the true love of His Majesty the King. In the last spring of the year 281 of the Egan calendar, it was still the Targaryen dynasty. After winning the tourney at Harrenhal, Prince Rhaegar placed the Winter Rose crown, which symbolizes the Queen of Love and Beauty, on the knees of Robert Baratheon's fiancée Lyanna Stark instead of his wife, Dornish Princess Elia Martell. Prince Rhaegar's face-to-face NTR behavior immediately caused an uproar. Soon after the end of the tourney, Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark both disappeared. Some people believe that Prince Rhaegar kidnapped and raped Robert's fiancée Lyanna Stark, and Robert himself also believed so. At the same time, there is also a saying that Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna were in love and eloped together. The affair between Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna triggered a civil war in the Seven Kingdoms, which eventually led to the fall of the Targaryen dynasty. Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the pair of ill-fated lovers, also died in the war and went to hell together. Even though Robert Baratheon had seized King's Landing and ascended the Iron Throne, he still couldn't forget Lyanna. But Lyanna had been dead for many years. How could the king see her again? Did His Majesty have hallucinations during the time he was in a coma? Or was His Majesty seriously injured and had a close call with death and saw the ghost of Lyanna who had already died? However, except for Eddard, these things were no longer important. Viserys defeated them and swept across half of the Riverlands to the south. Although Viserys' attack was very fast, the land he had occupied to the south was still in the final stages of the war. There were still sporadic soldiers from the Riverlands resisting, but the Dothraki army was already at the gates of the city. Riverrun was not very big, but it was a rare strong city. When it was attacked, the gates could be opened to release water to fill the entire artificial moat. In addition, Riverrun itself was surrounded by rivers on both sides. After the water was released, it became an island surrounded by water on three sides, which was indestructible. The Dothraki horses could not wade through the rushing river, and the men and horses were exhausted after the long journey. After Viserys led his army to the outskirts of Riverrun, he immediately ordered to set up camp and rest temporarily. Bang bang, a few arrows were shot out from the city, as if the Riverrun soldiers had not seen the famous scene where Viserys single-handedly challenged the twins and smashed the giant crossbow arrow with one sword. Only one arrow fell on the grass not far from Viserys, and the rest of the arrows fell into the rushing river. The silver-haired knight in bright armor looked at the arrows that fell beside him, and then raised his head to look at the nervous soldiers in Riverrun. "I will send a letter with arrows later, telling the people in the city to surrender or die. Let's go." Then Viserys did not say much, but turned his horse's head and returned to the camp with his guards. In Riverrun, after everyone's explanation, Robert finally understood that he was still alive, and that not all of these people were here to accompany him. The reality now has changed drastically from what Robert knew. Robert was once trapped in a desperate situation, and was attacked from both sides by the White Walkers, and his entire army was about to be wiped out. However, he did not expect that when he woke up, the White Walkers were defeated, and the coalition forces turned against Viserys, and then were defeated by Viserys again, and now they have fled to Riverrun. The area of Riverrun is not large, and a large number of coalition forces are even stationed on the other side of the Red Fork River. After understanding what happened in front of him, Robert, who was lying on the bed, rarely got angry and raged, but was silent for a long time, and then asked, "Can Riverrun be defended?" Everyone in the room was silent, and no one answered the king's question. "We have to defend it even if we can't, Your Majesty." At this time, Lord Randall Tarley of Hornhill, who was standing behind, spoke in a hoarse and low voice. Only one ear was left on his shiny head, and the other ear was bitten off in the battle with the White Walkers. The Mad King's son has crazy blood flowing in his body. The barbarians under his command have burned countless villages and massacred countless civilians during this period of time. The dragon's flames have burned many soldiers to death. If we can't defeat him, the bloodlines of ancient families with long traditions, such as Stark, Tully, Lannister, Tyrell, etc., will be cut off, and the Seven Kingdoms will also be destroyed in his hands. Randall Tarler's voice was low. His eyes were bright and sharp, and every family whose name he mentioned looked more or less uncomfortable, but they remained silent. My lords, think about what he did in the East Continent. Finally, Randall Tully looked around at everyone around him and warned. His words seemed to be the point, making everyone present look slightly terrified. Chapter 431 Sword of Change. Think about what Viserys did on the continent of Essos. All the nobles present had a slightly stern look on their faces. Why did Randall Tully warn the nobles present? Because anyone with a sharp mind could see that the changes Viserys made in the East Continent were digging up the foundations of all the families. Therefore, the ancient families named by Randall Tully, which had been passed down for thousands or even tens of thousands of years, had already existed when the ancestors and the children of the forest went to war. They were able to pass on for such a long time, but they were likely to perish under Viserys' changes. This is also why Viserys, who obviously had powerful power, still encountered stubborn resistance in the process of unifying Westeros, and no nobles surrendered. If there were no such changes, perhaps half of the Seven Kingdoms would have changed their flags and surrendered directly. But Viserys' changes were too threatening, so these nobles had to be daunted and even hostile. Viserys' changes in Essos were mainly carried out in two aspects. One is to open the source, divide the land of the big landlords into many small pieces of land, and give civilians a lot of opportunities to rely on military merits to advance. Everyone can be canonized as a knight, based on military merits, and even get a small piece of land as a reward, becoming a real aristocratic. The second is to deprive the traditional aristocracy of their autonomy. The nobles once had absolute rule over their fiefdoms. They can even promulgate laws on their own territories, recruit troops, collect taxes, and wage wars at will. The two major families fought each other under the system of the kingdom, and as their feudal lords, they had the power to let them sit down and mediate, and they could also watch them kill each other, and take the opportunity to consolidate their influence. Even the king of the seven countries is only a nominal lord, but a big noble in reality. If the guardians of the various places under his rule rebelled, his title of king would instantly become a bare commander, and the situation of strong vassals and weak monarchs often occurred. Therefore, Viserys is well aware of the drawbacks of the Westeros aristocratic system. The aristocracy with a long history is the biggest obstacle to social development. Therefore, Viserys began to reform this place from the time when his power began to be established, and carefully designed a system suitable for the unique culture of this world. The newly promoted nobles were once civilians and wandering knights, so naturally they had no opinions or resistance to the changes. But for the traditional nobles in Westeros, especially those old nobles who have been passed down for thousands of years, Viserys' reforms are like a knife cutting on their aorta. All military power is returned to the king, and the finances and taxes must be handed over to the treasury in proportion. The rest belongs to the nobles themselves, and they have completely become local officials. Some people even jumped and cursed Viserys, saying that this was the foundation of all nobles. His madness was even worse than his father, but the person who said this had already jumped into the river and committed suicide. Viserys' reforms were like a sword hanging over the heads of all nobles, and it might be cut down directly at any time. Therefore, at a time when the war is not yet completely clear, the nobles of the seven countries will not be willing to surrender easily and let themselves be slaughtered. Randall Tarler's words made the people present, who had been somewhat shaken, resolute. Yes, that's right. Agree. I agree. They must unite to resist Viserys. This is about the survival of the family, and none of them want to be the sinners in the family history. My lords, think about it. Those dirty mudlegs, those lowly people, will sit in the hall like us in the future. We even have to politely call him lord, but he can't even use a knife and fork, because his bitch mother has been eating with his hands since he was born. The old and grey-haired Earl of Redfort, Holden Redfort, said loudly in a hoarse voice, "Impossible. There will never be such a day. As soon as he finished speaking, he was immediately responded by the Earl of Golden Tree City, Mattis Rowan, who was dressed in a neat military uniform, holding the hilt of his sword with one hand, and spoke with a serious face. Although the Earl of Golden Tree City was widely loved, he still had a clear position on this issue, and represented the interests of the great nobles. Nobles are nobles, they are born noble, and commoners are commoners, they are born with a lowly fate. Just thinking about such a scene makes people sick. Another noble in the room also shook his head and said, "If that's the case, my dog can also be called a lord. Then I'll go back and ask my horse. See if it wants to be a lord." The room suddenly burst into laughter, and the tense atmosphere just now was swept away. Standing in front of the king's bed, Stannis, who usually doesn't smile, couldn't help laughing when he heard such words, and shook his head slightly. Too absurd. Old Lord Walder Free is right. Viserys is worthy of being the son of the Mad King. He is even crazier than his father. How could nobles be confused with commoners? Randall Tala's words seemed to ignite the atmosphere of the coalition nobles. Everyone became indignant and thought that Viserys dared to do this, and was even crazier than his father, the Mad King. Many nobles even hesitated to speak in front of Robert. But they wanted to say that, if Viserys wanted them to surrender, they must argue at the negotiation table and let Westeros maintain its noble tradition, and not be affected by the changes in the East Continent. Otherwise they would rather fight to the last man. In the room, only Tywin, Eddard and Robert on the sickbed did not smile. Tywin was still thinking about the crisis at hand, and Eddard was thinking about what Robert had just said. Robert could empathize the most. Viserys was doing what every generation of kings wanted to do, but constrained by the daunting resistance. No generation of kings dared to try to smash the wheel of aristocratic autocracy and change to a centralized system with stronger national strength and more unified power. If Viserys really succeeded, he might become a figure like Azor Ahai, Brandon the Builder, and the Grey King who will be remembered forever. Robert looked a little dazed, and the arrow wound on his right chest was still faintly recurring. And on the second day, at dawn in Reveron, the horn sounded suddenly. Endless Dothraki began to move at dawn. But they did not forcefully attack the indestructible Reveron, but bypassed the river and rushed directly to the coalition camp outside Reveron. Roar, roar, roar. 10,000 horses galloped on the land, and the Dothraki howled and rushed over. Last night, Viserys sent a letter to Reveron, asking them to kneel down and surrender, and hand over Robert Baratheon, Tywin, and Eddard Stark. But he was strongly rejected by Hoster Tully, the old Duke of Reveron. He told Viserys that he should take the barbarians and the dragon out of Westeros and never come back, otherwise they would kill the dragon and the barbarians. Viserys assured the Duke of Reveron, the guardian of the Riverlands, that the bloodline of the Tully family would be cut off, and Reveron would be reduced to ruins, and disappear forever in the long river of history. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 432, Battle of Reveron. Former formation. Former formation. Facing the overwhelming Dothraki cavalry, dense orders rang out in the coalition camp surrounding the Red Fork River. The nobles of the Seven Kingdoms swore to resist the attacks of dragons and barbarians, and as defenders of the civilized world, to protect the traditional glory of Westeros. The Dothraki's attack methods were flexible and varied, just like staring at a prey, constantly consuming and provoking their nerves, until they were exhausted, and then biting their necks off. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki rode on war horses and waved scimitars, circling around the coalition formation, constantly making piercing howls, giving the coalition soldiers great psychological pressure. The dragon hovered in the sky, shaking its wings, and passing over the coalition's heads, which made them terrified. Bang, bang, the bowstrings in the coalition army made a sound, and the crossbow arrows fired by the two giant crossbows broke through the air with a sharp sound, flying straight into the sky, but deviated by 108,000 miles. How the black dragon spread its wings, and flew in the sky. It was far away from the ground, and the crosses of the giant crossbow were extremely random. If you want to hit the dragon, you must predict its position in advance and judge the impact of the wind in the high altitude on the crossbow arrows. Luck accounts for the majority. In fact, if you want to use a giant crossbow to hit the dragon, the best chance is when the dragon flies down and spews flames. The closer the distance, the greater the chance of hitting, and the damage to the dragon. More than a dozen giant crossbows fired at close range at the same time, and perhaps 1 or 2 crossbow arrows will hit Balerion. This is how the opponent was caught off guard in the Battle of the Twins before, but unfortunately it did not hit the dragon's vitals. Other parts are covered with thick scales, and even if the crossbow arrows penetrated, it would be difficult to cause much damage, just like being pricked by a needle, and it was useless. The coalition forces used a giant crossbow to fire crossbow arrows, which was actually a test, hoping to scare off the dragon. But unfortunately, Balerion was not afraid at all, but reminded him of some bad memories. The dragon flew in the sky, and a low roar spread far away. On the ground, Viserys rode a snow-white warhorse, with hair like brocade, a tall body, strong thighs, and a pair of bright eyes. This warhorse has been with Viserys for many years, but since Viserys could ride a dragon to fight, he rarely fought side by side with this partner. Today Viserys decided to go into battle himself, and let Balerion play freely. Woo! A desolate horn sounded in the distance, and the white horse under Viserys' crotch stepped on the horse's hooves restlessly, as if he was eager to try. He was wearing a bright Valyrian steel armor, and holding a long spear made of pure steel. With a thud, the spear clenched gently on the ground, and the dust was stirred. His strength had already surpassed the extraordinary, and now he was close to the next realm. The wooden spears used by ordinary people were naturally no longer suitable for him, and he did not need to use the spears to unload the force. He could also easily swing a pure steel spear weighing dozens of kilograms. Cal, and Cargo, who followed Viserys, was wearing animal skin armor, his legs tied with horsehair tightly clamped around the horse's belly. He held a scimitar made of Valyrian steel in his hand and a bow and arrow on his back, and the warhorse under his crotch seemed to be eager to try. Cargo turned his head and looked at Viserys beside him, while Viserys looked into the distance, pulled the reins of the warhorse, and finally nodded slightly. The next second, woo, the horn in the Dothraki camp finally sounded. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki, who surrounded the coalition camp from all directions, rushed towards the coalition formation in the center, surging like the rising tide of the sea. Rumble, the galloping of horses' hooves shook the eardrums, and the ground was shaking slightly. The allied soldiers formed a battle formation, holding their spears and shields tightly in their hands. They swallowed their saliva, and felt the stones in the grass under their feet jumping gently. Everyone, raise your shields. Duke Tywin, wearing dark gold armor and a red cloak, rode a warhorse to inspect the front line and personally commanded the battle. The king was still resting in Riverrun, and the acting commander was naturally Tywin Lannister. His face was serious and meticulous, and he didn't seem to be afraid at all. His red cloak fluttered in the wind. Raise your shields. Raise your spears. Not far away, on Riverrun, which was surrounded by water on 3 sides. My lord, please be careful. As the guardian of the Riverland, Hoster Tully, the Duke of Riverrun, climbed to the top of the city with the help of his guards. Seeing the overwhelming barbarians rushing towards the coalition in the distance, his face was a little ugly. These barbarians, he had not personally experienced the war between humans and White Walkers, so he had some unclear judgments about Viserys' strength. Edgemure did tell him, but people become stubborn when they get old, and the old Duke did not listen. After he said those harsh words yesterday, he actually felt a little regretful. His original intention was to show the integrity of the Tully family and to get more bargaining chips at the negotiation table in the future. After all, Riverrun is easy to defend and difficult to attack. Only 200 people are needed to resist the attack of tens of thousands of troops, and there are a lot of supplies stored under Riverrun that can sustain people and horses for 2 years. What's more, there are tens of thousands of coalition troops helping to defend the city, more than twice the number of the sons of the Mad King on the opposite side. Hoster Tully did not think that the coalition would lose, at least not too ugly. However, today he climbed the city wall and saw the dragon for the first time. Ho! Balerion roared, and then swooped down from the sky. Dozens of giant crossbows on the ground below fired crossbow arrows at the same time, but they were all dodged by it one by one. Rumble. Then the surging dragon flames hit the ground, and the formation of the coalition army was instantly torn apart by the dragon flames. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki who rushed over howled and waved their scimitars, rushing in along the hole, torn open for them by the dragon. Clang clang. The sound of metal collisions was everywhere. Puff, a Dothraki waved his scimitar and directly cut the throat of a Lannister soldier wearing red and black armor, and the body immediately fell to the ground. Die. Another riverbend spearman wearing plate armor roared and pierced the warhorse under the crotch of a Dothraki with a spear. The warhorse neighed in pain, but also knocked the spearman out like a high-speed car, and fell heavily to the ground. Bang. However, before he could get up from the ground, the chaotic and noisy horse hooves trampled over him. A horse hoof stepped on his head, and his cheek was immediately covered in blood and flesh. The soldier from the riverbend howled in pain. Then, the warhorse that rushed up from behind directly crushed his head, and the sound of a snap was like a crushed ice cream ball, and the ground was smeared with bright red and milky white. Chapter 433, The Power of Giants. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki kept howling, wantonly harvesting the lives of the allied soldiers. And Viserys, riding a white horse, was naturally among them. As a cow, it was one of the traditions of the Dothraki to lead the troops. However, Viserys usually rode a dragon, but today he personally rode a warhorse into battle. Silver gold hair hung on the cold armor. Viserys held a blood-stained spear in his hand, and the warhorse under his crotch was also dyed blood red. At this time, the sound of wind suddenly sounded in his ears. Viserys looked around and listened to all directions. He reacted quickly and slightly tilted his head to avoid the arrow. The arrow stuck to his hair and drilled into the air. Whoosh! Viserys sat on the horse's back and held the reins with one hand. He looked in the direction of the sudden arrow and found a thin middle-aged knight with a green-haired turtle-like emblem on his left chest. The Ethman family of Greenstone Castle? Viserys had a particularly deep memory of this emblem, so much so that, when he was a child, he could not help laughing every time he saw it. When he followed Maester Daniel to learn about the emblems and language of each family. The Esmond family is considered a relative of the Baratheon family, especially Robert. Robert's mother is from the Esmond family, Cassandra Esmond, so the Esmond family naturally responded to the call for this war. The person who shot the cold arrow was none other than Lord Eldon Esmond's eldest son, Ser Aemon Esmond. He also rode a white horse and looked at Viserys. He recognized the other party's identity. The entire Dothraki army was full of grassland knights, and only Viserys seemed a little out of place. Then Aemon threw away the bow and arrow in his hand, drew the long sword at his waist, roared, and urged his horse to kill Viserys. However, Viserys, holding a bloodstained spear in his hand, rode his horse and stood still without moving, just watching the green turtle knight rushing towards him, then raised the spear in his hand and turned it around, and with a puff, he stabbed the opponent's chest accurately. He picked up Aemon Estament's body from the horse's back with one hand, held it high in the air, and then threw it to the ground with a plop. Aemon's horse was frightened and ignored the master's body and fled away. Son of the Mad King. Die. Viserys had just killed Aemon Estamant, the heir to Greenstone, and at this moment, an armored allied knight rushed towards Viserys with a spear in his hand. He saw this golden opportunity and wanted to kill Viserys by himself and become a hero of the Seven Kingdoms. Kill. Boom boom. The horses galloped, and the momentum was fierce. Viserys pulled the spear out of Aemon's body, and blood dripped onto the ground. He turned his head when he heard the noise, and there was no fear on his face. Instead, he looked very calm. Bang! At this moment, a mountain covered with heavy armor suddenly appeared beside Viserys. He ran over and knocked the knight and his horse away. The warhorse neighed in pain in midair, and its four hooves struggled. The knight on the horse was even more embarrassed and was thrown off the horse. Then he fell to the ground with a dull sound. The man under the tin can was knocked unconscious and almost died. Blood gushed out of his nose and forehead and flowed into his eyes. The knight of the coalition army trembled and struggled to get up from the ground, but a Dothraki who was howling passed by him on his warhorse and cut his throat with a knife. Puff! The horse's hoof passed by him, and the knight's blood sprayed on the ground. His warhorse's waist was broken, and it lay on the ground struggling in pain, but could not get up. Viserys looked at the scene in front of him and then retracted his gaze, raised his head slightly, and looked at the mountain in front of him, nodded and spoke calmly. "Thank you, Mag. Magmaz Tundo Dolweg is the Giant King, and he has now surrendered to Viserys." Viserys tailored a set of heavy armor for him and his wife, and changed their weapons from sticks and stones to a giant axe that was also tailored. At this moment, the strong Mag carried the huge axe on his shoulder, and his armor was covered with arrows, like a hedgehog, but none of these arrows penetrated the armor. If a regular human wore such heavy armor, it would be difficult to move, or even be directly pressed to the ground. But the giant moved freely, like a humanoid monster, rampaging on the battlefield, and destroying the formation of the coalition. Mag's wife, the gentle leader, was also here. The two giants fighting side by side became a new nightmare for the coalition soldiers. There was a huge dragon that covered the sky and the sun, constantly spewing dragon flames, and there were terrifying creatures like giants on the ground. The coalition soldiers felt as if they were in a battlefield in the mythological period, with gods fighting, dragons flying, and giants beating their chests and roaring. Boom. Then the huge axe in the hand of another giant was thrown out directly, with great force and heavy power, and a large number of coalition soldiers were directly swept to the ground, knocked unconscious. Roar, roar, roar. Then the Dothraki rushed forward and cut their throats one by one, and the galloping horses tore the coalition formation into pieces. Roar. The female wildling roared, crushing a coalition soldier who jumped up and wanted to stab Herney. Then she threw his body back into the coalition formation like a chicken and knocked down 2 more people, frightening the coalition soldiers. Ada was not gentle at all, but extremely fierce. In comparison, her husband, the king, was really much gentler. Yeah. Mag, who was much taller than Ada, nodded slightly at Viserys below. Then he caught up with his beloved wife with a huge axe on his shoulder and continued to kill forward. Viserys looked at the backs of the 2 giants going away and slowly retracted his gaze. The surrounding smoke was full of gunpowder, and the giant dragon kept spewing dragon flames downwards. The flames burned blazingly and rushed straight into the sky, which could be seen from a long distance. A fight on the riverbank outside Reveron dyed the river red, and the defenders huddled in Reveron were terrified as they watched the bloodthirsty Dothraki outside, the giants with amazing destructive power, and the flying dragons above their heads. "It's over." Host Tully, the Duke of Reveron, held the wall with his hands and closed his eyes slightly. He felt a little dizzy and almost fell to the ground. But he was supported by the Tully family guards beside him, so that the old duke did not lose his composure. Chapter 434, Raid from Behind. Just when the coalition forces were unable to withstand the pressure of the Dothraki and were about to collapse, on the battlefield on the riverbank outside Reveron, the rumbling sound of iron hooves suddenly sounded behind the Dothraki army. Countless Vale Knights held up the Eagle banner and went around the back of the Dothraki and launched a surprise attack. This was a tactic discussed by the coalition forces. The main force on the front line held back Viserys' army, while the Vale Knights pretended to have an internal conflict, broke away from the base camp, and went around to the back. According to the agreed time, they calculated that Viserys would launch an attack today, and then prepared to launch a surprise attack. In order to make Viserys believe that there was really an internal conflict within the coalition forces, the Vale Knights, under the command of Runestone Earl Jon Royce, deliberately took a long detour. He led the Vale Knights along the river road straight to the town of Earl Harroway, ran a long way in one breath, and then made a big circle back, trying to catch Viserys off guard from behind. However, the agreed time was accurate and the plan was perfect. Jon Royce led the Vale Knights to exhaustion. But they never expected that the situation on the battlefield was not what they imagined. They were in a state of anxiety, but instead presented a one-sided situation. The Dothraki who repeatedly charged in and out of the coalition army's formation had become riddled with holes under the dragon's flames and the destruction of the giants. The coalition army's formation had been beaten into a sieve, and the Dothraki were harvesting their lives at will. However, the arrival of the Vale cavalry still became a shot of adrenaline, hitting the coalition soldiers on the verge of collapse hard, and the coalition soldiers began to fight back. Kill. Kill all these barbarians. Kill the son of the Mad King. Stannis, covered in blood, was fighting hard, and the sword in his hand had been cut, and the blade was curled. He stood in a sea of blood and corpses, and his eyes even became a little dazed. The whole world was full of scarlet colors, flames, blood, and bright scimitars. Roar, roar, roar! A Dothraki cavalry rushed towards him, waving a scimitar. Stannis subconsciously raised his sword to block it, but failed to block it, and was chopped on the shoulder. Blood gushed out from the gap in the armor. If it weren't for the armor blocking it, this knife would have directly cut off his left arm. The intense pain made Stannis suddenly sober up. He gasped and waved his sword to fight back, but was pierced through the calf by a flying arrow. Puff, blood gushed out all at once. Humph. Stannis groaned in pain, and knelt on the ground, and the obscure Dothraki language sounded above his head. This man looks like the leader of the lambs. The Khal asked to leave them alive. A Dothraki said to Casco beside him. The dark-eyed Casco looked at Stannis, who was kneeling below him with a face full of pain, with an indifferent expression, and nodded slightly. Then let him live. Take him away. In the smoke-filled battlefield, the Dothraki horses trampled on the surrounding land, and a group of grassland knights surrounded Stannis and howled. Then a rope fell from the sky, and was directly put around Stannis' neck, and pulled him to the ground. A Dothraki cavalryman was skilled in horse catching. He held the hemp rope with one hand, and rode around Stannis. He pulled down with his palm slightly, and the rope around Stannis' neck suddenly tightened. He tried desperately to break free, but it was useless, and his face turned red. Roar, roar! The Dothraki dragged Stannis on horseback like a wild dog, dragging him on the ground, and pulling him aside to tie him up. Stop. Let go of Lord Stannis. On the chaotic battlefield, a soldier from Storm's End with a crown stag emblem on his chest saw this scene. He roared and drew his sword to rescue Stannis, but was blocked by a Dothraki who fell off his horse. The soldier from Storm's End stabbed him with a sword, and the skilled Dothraki warrior directly clamped the blade with his elbow, and then cut his throat with a knife in the other's unbelievable eyes. Puff, the body fell headfirst on the charred land. Not far away, countless Vale Knights suddenly appeared on the battlefield from the back, and then rushed over like a tide. Kill. Earlyon Royce, the commander of the Vale Knights, also went into battle in person, holding a long sword, and countless Vale Knights gathered around him, and killed towards the distant battlefield. In their imagination, the Dothraki should be panicked, or even flee in all directions, because the cavalry rushing around the back is a devastating blow to any army. However, the Dothraki did not panic. Instead, they kept riding and howling to confuse their targets. What greeted the Vale Knights was a giant spinning axe and a dragon swooping down from the sky, opening its abyssal mouth, with a dazzling red light in its throat. The Earl of Runestone City, Earlyon Royce, was wearing bronze armor. He watched this scene with his eyes wide open, his throat rolled slightly, and he swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Damn it. Then he mustered up the courage, and jumped off the high-speed galloping horse a second before the dragon flame was launched. He fell to the ground with a plop and rolled, almost fainting, and a red light lit up in the sky above his head. Rumble, the dragon's flames spit out madly washed the earth, directly submerging the position where Earlyon Royce should appear. Countless Vale Knights let out terrible wails in the flames, and their armor wrapped in flesh and blood, along with their horses, collapsed and burned to ashes. Ding, a Vale Knight and a Dothraki started a battle. The Arak scimitar chopped on the heavy breastplate, but failed to break the defense. Then the Vale Knight wearing the family emblem stabbed the horse with a sword. The giant mag rushed to the Vale Knight's formation, picked up the huge axe he had just thrown, and chopped the knight who rushed over, directly splitting the opponent in half with the axe. The scene was extremely bloody. Roar. Then Mag hammered his chest angrily, bathed in the red firelight, and let out a deafening roar. The surrounding Vale Knights were all frightened, and fled in all directions. Not far away, Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, was covered in blood, holding the two-handed sword dice made of Valyrian steel and fighting hard. There were countless bodies falling around him. Some were allied soldiers, and some were Dothraki. Viserys saw Eddard Stark not far away, and then urged his horse to walk over here, then pulled the reins and dismounted. Kill. On the chaotic battlefield, there were flames everywhere, and shouts of killing were everywhere. Eddard supported the hilt of the sword with one hand and panted slightly. He looked at the silver-haired knight who dismounted, and walked towards him, and his eyes revealed a complexity that was difficult to conceal. Viserys. The air around was full of gunpowder and blood. Bang, the spear was stuck in the ground. Viserys walked towards Eddard with one hand on the hilt of the sword, and then stopped 2 or 3 meters away from the Duke of Winterfell and said, "Surrender, Lord Stark. The war is over. I have to hurry up and write the second chapter. I have been so busy recently." Chapter 435, The End of the War. However, Eddard did not speak, but just gasped, then pulled out the ice from the ground and slashed at Viserys with a sword. But the silver-haired young man in front of him slightly turned sideways and easily dodged. Then he grabbed the wrist of the Duke of Winterfell with one hand, clenched his fist with the other hand, and punched Eddard Stark in the face. Bang! This punch hit hard, and the opponent's eyes were full of stars. The nose bone seemed to be broken, and blood gushed out instantly. The Valyrian steel sword in his hand also fell to the ground with a clang. Eddard Stark was knocked down by Viserys' punch, lying on his back on the ground. His cheeks were full of blood, and he gasped for breath, and could no longer get up. The battlefield was filled with smoke and shouts of killing were everywhere. Viserys stood in front of Eddard Stark, was silent for a while, and wiped the blood from his fist. At this moment, the air of the battlefield was filled with a strong smell of blood and burnt smells. This smell was disgusting, but he had already gotten used to it. For Eddard Stark, based on his impression in his previous life, Viserys actually admired him more than he hated him. He was fair and selfless, and he abided by his honor. At first, he was even a little annoyed by this man's stubbornness and his credulity and the tricks of the treacherous, which eventually ruined a good situation and his life in vain. If he could put aside his current identity, he actually wanted to be friends with him, looking at Robb, Sansa, Arya and other little wolves. However, it was a pity that with Viserys' current identity, Eddard was destined to become his enemy, and there was little room for reconciliation between the two sides. Even if Viserys didn't care about his father, the Mad King, and his brother Rhaegar Targaryen, in his heart, besides Daenerys and Rhaenys, the only person he recognized was his mother, Queen Rhaela. But in the public eye, he had to avenge his father and brother, and punish his enemies, even if it was fake. Cal. 2 Dothraki came from behind, their eyes full of admiration. Just now, this lamb killed several of their best fighters, but was knocked down by a punch in front of the Cal. Cora. Viserys tilted his head slightly to look at the 2 people beside him, and then spoke in Dothraki, asking them to tie up Eddard. The 2 Dothraki nodded after hearing the Cal's order, walked up to pull Eddard, who was lying on the ground with blood on his face, and tied his hands with hemp rope. Go. Eddard was pushed to the back by the Dothraki. The weapon he dropped, ice, was not left on the battlefield, but was picked up and taken to the back as an important trophy. The material used for this great sword is sufficient, and if it is remelted, it is enough to cast 2 Valyrian steel swords. Fortunately, Valyrian steel is a material that is hard, never curls, is extremely sharp, and is very light. Otherwise, it would be easy to get exhausted wielding such a big sword in battle. The war is over. The Targaryen army attacked the coalition camp of up to 50,000 with 20,000 Dothraki cavalry. Both sides invested more than 70,000 troops in a fierce battle on the Red Fork River beach outside Riverrun. The dragon's flames burned the weeds on the river beach, and the fire spread like wildfire. The billowing smoke rushed straight into the sky, forming a rare grassland fire. The fire burned for 3 days, and was not completely extinguished. As the highest level commanders of the coalition, Stannis and Eddard Stark were captured alive, and a number of small nobles were killed or injured. But the Targaryen army did not find the acting commander of the coalition, Tywin Lannister. The sky was dark and the sun was setting. "Sir, we are almost to the branded castle." A Lannister soldier wearing black armor with gold edges and a bright red cloak stood at the bow and looked forward, then turned his head and spoke to Lord Tywin, who was sitting behind him. The branded castle is a castle in the Westerly, located in a hilly area at the source of the Tankstone River. The owner of the castle is the Marbrand family, who are loyal to the Lannister family. Their family emblem is a blazing tree, and the current lord is Earl Daemon Marbrand. Lord Tywin's mother, Jean Marbrand, is Earl Daemon Marbrand's aunt, so Daemon can be considered Tywin's cousin. It turned out that this old lion, as the commander of the entire army, learned about the situation on the battlefield earlier, and knew that the situation was hopeless, so he left the battlefield by boat, in advance under the protection of his family guards, and fled directly to the branded castle. Tywin Lannister sat on the boat. His face and body still had bloodstains that had not been wiped clean, and the cloak behind him was torn, looking a bit embarrassed, but his back was still straight. His light green eyes were dotted with a little gold, and his face was deeply tired. "Let's do it here." Tywin, the commander of the entire army, abandoned his soldiers and fled, drifting on the boat for so long, and remained silent throughout the whole process. Only then did he look up at the dim sky and the setting sun that was about to disappear, and spoke in a hoarse voice. "Yes, Duke." Several Lannister family soldiers hurriedly agreed, and then several small boats docked on the shore of the Tengshi River. Everyone on the boat jumped off the boat and jumped onto the river beach by the Tengshi River, which was full of broken stones and sparsely populated. There were deep mountains and old forests on both sides of the Tengshi River, and mudslides often occurred, so people gradually moved away from here. Let go of the boats and let them drift with the water. Tywin's mind was thoughtful and deep. He stood on the bank of the Tengshi River and looked around, then spoke again in a hoarse voice. The soldiers therefore let go of the ropes and let the boats drift on the river, drifting with the water, confusing the direction of the possible pursuers. Then Tywin and his party went into the mountains of the westerly and disappeared without a trace. And not long after Tywin and his party went into the deep mountains and old forests, suddenly, a burst of shouting and hoarse neighing came from the bank of the Tengshi River, and there was also an obscure Dothraki language. "Hey!" A group of grassland cavalry chased along the direction of the Tengshi River, but only saw a few small boats floating on the river. Then, under the loud command of Casco, the group of Dothraki gave up their horses and began to search the mountains along the way, but found nothing. The mountains in the westerly are undulating and densely forested. Once people hide in them, even the dragons cannot find their traces. What's more, the sun was setting, and the sky was getting dark. The Dothraki had no choice but to return to the camp. Chapter 436 Conspiracy. The Dothraki went deep into the mountains of the westerly along the Tengshi River, but they did not catch any trace of Tywin. Tywin fled back to the westerly by boat. Stannis and Eddard Stark were captured on the battlefield, and Randall Tully was nowhere to be found. Roar, the coalition forces were completely defeated and fled in all directions. The Dothrakis captured more than 20,000 prisoners all over the mountains and plains like catching pigs. The morale of the coalition forces was completely defeated by the dragons, giants and this group of barbarians. Because of the lack of ropes, many of the captured coalition soldiers were not tied up, but only their armor and weapons were confiscated. Even a Dothraki cavalryman could make dozens of defeated soldiers lay down their weapons, hand over their armor, and surrender obediently. These dozens of people were not tied up, but they were still like zombies. They did not dare to escape, let alone resist. They followed the Dothraki horses and were captured as prisoners. There are many such exaggerated famous scenes. In the final analysis, many of the coalition soldiers are just the temporary soldiers captured to deal with the White Walkers. They are not real soldiers at all. They are okay in a favorable battle, but they will be defeated in an unfavorable battle. However, although the coalition captured many prisoners, after being defeated outside Riverrun, many of the defeated soldiers of the coalition still fled. They fled into the woods and mountains in one breath, disappeared without a trace, and later became the main scourge of the river basin. After the defeat of the coalition, some died and some fled, and some were captured, but Robert Baratheon, the king of the Seven Kingdoms who was seriously injured and not recovered, could not go anywhere. Riverrun was surrounded on three sides, and he was still trapped in the city, and could not leave, becoming a bird in a cage. Then the night gradually enveloped the entire battlefield. After a day of fierce fighting, the Targaryen army began to withdraw troops and slowly retreated to the base camp with many prisoners. The gates of Riverrun were closed from beginning to end, and there was no sound at all, as if waiting to die. The air was filled with a heavy atmosphere and completely fell into deathly silence. The sky was dark at night. Torches on the walls of Riverrun were burning with flames, dispelling the surrounding darkness and emitting light. The soldiers of the Riverlands were patrolling the walls in armor, guarding against the Targaryen army's night attack on the walls. However, each of them had a look of absent-mindedness on their faces. It was obvious that the battle on the Red Fork River during the day had a great impact on the defenders, and everyone in Riverrun was in a panic. A pale man with a weak body of fat was on duty on the wall. He was wearing a large suit of armor, but it couldn't cover his bulging belly. Winter had just left, and spring had just arrived. The temperature at night in Riveron was not warm, but a little bit cold, but this obese man kept wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Lord Mouton. At this time, a soldier from the Riverlands came up the stairs from under the city wall with a torch in his hand. His eyes were a little evasive, and then he greeted him. William Mouton is the Earl of Maiden Spring and the current patriarch of the Mouton family. His brother, Miss Mouton, was once a servant of Prince Rieger. William was weak by nature and had poor ability. If it were not for the situation, he would never come to the front battlefield. However, he did not expect that he came to the battlefield with his head held high, and before he had time to see the White Walkers were defeated. William Mouton was very fortunate that he escaped, and at the same time, he was secretly grateful to Viserys for repelling the White Walkers. May he live long. But William did not expect that Duke Tywin would attempt to plot against Viserys in the blink of an eye. The short-lived alliance between the Dragon family and the Deer family broke down in an instant and a fierce battle broke out. The coalition forces were defeated by the dragons and barbarians, and were chased all the way from the Twins to Riveron. In this situation, William Mouton followed the army, and fled all the way back to Riveron. At this time, someone called his name. William Mouton was stunned for a moment, then turned around, and saw a soldier from the Bracken family in the Riverlands. The other party whispered a few words in his ear, and William Mutton's fat cheeks suddenly changed color. Then he looked into the other party's eyes to make sure that the other party was not deceiving him, and finally nodded. Okay, I know. Then William Mutton's fat on his belly trembled slightly, and he solemnly told the guards on the city wall a few words, telling them not to slack off, to guard here well, and to open their eyes a little, and then he followed the soldier down the city wall with his belly. However, what he didn't notice was that a Tully family soldier with a silver trout emblem on his chest looked at their backs as they left, frowned slightly, and a hint of suspicion appeared in his eyes. Then he also walked down from the city wall and hurriedly ran straight to the location of the sanctuary in Riveron. This cathedral was built by Lord Hoster Tully for his wife, Minessa Riveron, in her beloved garden. He had just heard that the Duke was praying in the cathedral at this moment. On the other side, William Mutton followed the footsteps of the soldiers and turned around in Riveron and came to a small room that was particularly hidden. There were two guards here who seemed to be chatting casually, but in fact their eyes were vigilantly scanning the surroundings. They saw the visitor and Earl William Mutton, looked at each other, and nodded to each other. Then the soldier who led William Mutton here also looked around vigilantly, and then stretched out his hand to push open the door in front of him, inviting the Earl of Maiden Spring City to come in. And William Mutton was not polite, and walked in slightly out of breath. At this moment, many people had gathered in the room, most of whom were nobles from the Riverlands and many wealthy knights. The Lord of the Riverlands summoned all his vassals to garrison in Riveron, so a large number of nobles from the Riverlands were now stockpiled in Riveron. However, these people gathered together at this critical moment, and there must be nothing good going on. Lord William is here. Welcome. The bald Earl of Stonehenge, Janus Bracken, who was sitting in the middle chair, stood up from his chair and clapped. With him taking the lead, the other nobles and knights in the small house also clapped absent-mindedly. Welcome Lord Mouton. However, William Mouton took a deep breath and waved his hand unhappily. Don't try to be so, Janus. If you have something to say it quickly. What do you want to do by calling me here? The two of them were old acquaintances. They had visited prostitutes together and knew each other well. Therefore, when Janus sent someone to find him under such circumstances, William Mouton immediately realized something. Janus Bracken saw that his old friend was so straightforward and no longer hesitated. It's like this. Then he openly told his plan. Chapter 437, Civil Disturbance in Riveron. I have an elder brother, you know. That was decades ago, and many people may have forgotten it. Janus Bracken's elder brother, Geoffrey, served Viserys and served as his king's hand for many years. Although Geoffrey Bracken has taken the initiative to give up his position, he still occupies a high position as the Lord Admiral and is the naval commander of the Targaryen forces. However, Geoffrey is from the Bracken family, and not many people know this news. Littlefina is one of them, and Jonarin is also one of them, but Jonarin is dead, and Littlefina did not spread it everywhere. Therefore, many people still don't know that Janus Bracken's brother is the current naval commander of the Targaryen army. Janus told all the plans that everyone had just conspired, and their group of Riverland nobles and knights were also stimulated by the fierce battle during the day. They believed that the might of the dragon was unstoppable. Although Riverran was strong and easy to defend, it was okay to deal with ordinary soldiers, but it was nonsense to deal with the dragon. They were afraid of repeating the disaster of Harrenhal, and were unwilling to be buried with the Tullys, so they decided to launch a rebellion tonight. They wanted to kill all the Tullys, capture King Robert Baratheon who was trapped in Riverran, and give Riverran and the fake king to Viserys in exchange for his forgiveness and reward. Therefore, these nobles gathered here to prepare for the rebellion. Janus Bracken invited the Earl of Maidenpool to join in the rebellion and threatened him that Viserys' threat was still vivid in his mind. If they did not take action to draw a clear line with the Tullys, they would be buried with Riverran. Harrenhal was a lesson learned from the past. When Aegon the Conqueror asked Harren the Black to surrender, he was strongly rejected. Aegon said, the bloodline of the Harren family must be cut off. The fact is that Aegon later rode a dragon to burn Harrenhal, and Harren the Black was burned to death in the tallest tower, which was later called the King's Tower. It is said that the ghosts of the Harren family still haunt this place, cursing every family that later obtained Harrenhal. Without exception, they all ended up with their families broken up, and their families destroyed. This is called the Harrenhal curse. William Mouton was coaxed and threatened by Janus Bracken, and agreed to join the rebellion. However, at this moment, on the other side of Riverran, the Tully family soldiers who rushed to the Sept to find the old duke did not find Hoster Tully, but found his son Edmure Tully. The young heir of Riverran is not a waste. He was able to survive several wars with the White Walkers. Edmure heard about this, and instantly realized that something was wrong. At this critical moment, the army is approaching, and Riverran is surrounded. Are the vassals of the Tully family conspiring in the city? This does not look like they are discussing anything good, and even exposes their disloyalty nakedly. Edmure was furious, and immediately told the soldiers not to look for his father, and let him rest in peace. He also ordered the soldiers to gather all the soldiers loyal to the Tully family in Riverran, and he would personally go into battle to eliminate these traitors. Edmure's order was passed down. Although there were soldiers brought by other vassals in Riverran, the soldiers loyal to the Tully family still accounted for the majority, and everyone quickly gathered. However, Edmure was only concerned with shock and anger. He mobilized the army to take the initiative and eliminate the traitors, but his action was too big, and the area of Riverran was not large, which led to the rebels who were plotting to keenly notice the abnormality here. They found that the plan seemed to have been leaked, and the Tully family had noticed it, but at this time, the arrow was on the string, and had to be fired. Now it was impossible to forgive the Tully family. Therefore, the rebels who were plotting to surrender the city decisively launched an attack in advance. Lord Janus Bracken personally led the rebels through the hall, and attacked the main keep of Riverran, which was the bedroom of Lord Hoster Tully, and King Robert Baratheon also rested in the main keep. The main keep of Riverran, like the city, was designed in a triangle, easy to defend, and difficult to attack, with a balcony protruding to the east, which could be reached by a spiral staircase. Edmure personally went into battle, looking good, and looked like a general. He led a large number of Tully soldiers and just passed by the main keep. The Tully soldiers and the rebels collided head-on in front of the main keep. When the enemies met, they were particularly jealous. When the two armies collided, they didn't say a word, so both sides roared, and drew their swords and rushed forward. Kill. Immediately, a fierce civil war broke out in Riverran, with the sound of metal colliding, shouts of killing, the sound of weapons piercing flesh and blood, and screams. The sudden outbreak of civil war in the castle alarmed the old Duke Hoster Tully, who was resting in his bedroom. Because of Edmure's special request, the soldiers did not inform the old duke, but followed Lord Edmure to prepare to suppress the rebellion. Therefore, the old duke had no idea about the rebellion, and was sleeping soundly in his bedroom. Then he was startled by the sudden shouting and killing from under the castle. He thought that the Dothraki had already rushed into Riverran, so he hurriedly put on his nightgown, and picked up a sword, and went to the balcony to take a look. But Hoster himself did not expect that. As soon as he walked out of the balcony, before he had time to see what happened, a sling flew over in the darkness and hit him directly in the chest. Puff, blood splattered. The white-haired old duke let out a hoarse scream, and the sword in his hand fell to the ground. The arrow in his chest was bleeding, and his body fell directly on the balcony. Among the rebels below, some sharp-eyed people saw Hoster Tully, the guardian of the Riverlands and the Duke of Reveron, fall on the balcony after being shot by an arrow, and immediately shouted excitedly, "The old dog of the Tully family has been shot by an arrow. Hoster Tully is dead." The rebels shouted loudly in an attempt to undermine the morale of the enemy, and the soldiers of the Tully family could not help but look up at the balcony on the main castle after hearing them shouting. Then they saw the old duke with an arrow in his chest lying on the balcony dying, and then his body softened and fell to the ground. Damn traitor. Lord Tully. What the rebels did not expect was that Hoster was quite respected and loved by the soldiers of the Tully family. When they saw the old duke being shot by the rebels, all the soldiers of the Tully family had red eyes and rushed directly towards the rebels. Kill. Revenge for Lord Duke. Chapter 438, Death of Lord Tully. Father. Edgemure watched his father fall down and instantly felt like being struck by lightning. He stood there blankly and even couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't believe that his father, who was as tall as a mountain, would fall down one day. Then the heir of Reveron's eyes became a little red and tears rolled in his eyes. He drew his sword and roared and led the way to kill. The fat Earl of Maidenpool, William Mouton, didn't rush to the front. He wanted to shrink behind, but for some reason he met Edgemure with red eyes. The other party roared and rushed up. Although William Mouton himself knew a few swordsmanship, how could he compare with the young and energetic Edgemure? Clang clang, the metal collided and made a sound. After only 3 or 2 strokes, the Earl of Maidenpool was pierced through the chest by Edgemure's sword. The bright tip of the sword penetrated the armor and came out from behind. The blood gushed out and dyed the armor red. William Mouton originally joined the rebel camp in order to survive, but he did not expect that he would die in Reveron. His eyes were filled with resentment, and blood flowed from the corners of his mouth. Then Edgemure kicked William Mouton's body to the ground and pulled out the long sword from his body with a sound of poof. Then, in a rage, Edgemure strode forward with the blood-stained long sword and once again chopped down a rebel soldier with a sword. Kill. The shouts and cries in Reveron shook the sky, and there were fierce battles everywhere. The death of Duke Tully did not calm one side down or surrender, but instead intensified the conflict. The rebels and the soldiers of the Tully family fought fiercely in the city. The shouts and cries alarmed Hoster Tully, and naturally had already alarmed Robert Baratheon and his king's goods, who were also recuperating in the castle. 7 layers of hell. Who can tell me what is going on outside? Robert Baratheon was lying on the hospital bed, his chest still bandaged, but he was able to sit up from the bed. The arrow pierced his chest and almost killed him, but in the end, Robert was lucky enough to survive. Now Robert wanted to stand up from the bed with the help of the head of the bed to see what was happening outside, but he was held down by his king's good Captain Barristan Selmy. "Your Majesty, there are rebels attacking the city outside. It is too dangerous to go out now. I will protect your Majesty here." The grey-haired old knight held the hilt of the sword with one hand, and his expression was serious. In this situation, you can almost use your toes to figure out what is going on outside. The defeat of the coalition forces during the day has almost laid the foundation for the fall of Reveron. Seeing that the situation is over, the nobles in the city are naturally unwilling to coexist with Reveron, and they will definitely do something weird at this time. And because of the special defense structure of Reveron, it is not easy to break through this majestic city from the inside. Therefore, the rebels want to attack the main castle first, capture Duke Tully and King Robert alive, and then use them as hostages to demand that the Tully family give up resistance and surrender Reveron. At this time, in the fierce fighting under the castle, the cry of Duke Tully's death suddenly came. What? Hearing the news that Hoster Tully was dead, the faces of everyone in the room changed slightly, except for Sir Merintrant, the king's guard, who was sitting on the chair on the other side. Merintrant's eyes flickered slightly, secretly looking at the king with naked upper body and his captain Barristan Selmy, while Sir Mandon Moore was standing by the door guarding the gate to prevent the rebels from killing from outside. Then King Robert asked to go out and take a look again, but was rejected by the captain of the King's Guard. The two argued for a few words, and finally Robert could not convince this stubborn old man, and sat back on the bed angrily. Robert himself could not go out, but he ordered Sir Mandan Moore, who was guarding the gate, to go out and see what happened. Did Duke Tully really encounter an accident? Yes, Your Majesty. Sir Mandan Moore, who was wearing a white cloak, also had a serious face. He nodded slightly and pushed the door open and walked out. Only King Robert, Barristan and Merintrent were left in the room. However, the three people in the room waited for a moment, but did not wait for Sir Mandan Moore to return, but heard his screams. "Stop! What are you doing?" Sir Mandan Moore's voice was urgent, shocked and angry, and then there was the sound of swords clashing. Clang clang. Sir Mandan Moore seemed to have killed two people, but then he himself screamed. Ah! Suddenly, there was a fierce fight in the main castle of Reverin and the sound of footsteps spiraling up the stairs. Quick! Quick! Capture Robert Baratheon alive! Capture the false king alive! It turned out that the rebels, under the command of Janus, had no way to attack the main castle of Reverin head on. Then the cunning Janus sent out several good men to climb up the wall from the other side of the castle with ropes. The rebels opened a passage from the inside of the castle, and then some of the rebels poured into the castle. The main battlefield of the fight between the two sides was transferred from outside the castle to here. Many rebels took the lead and walked along the steps to the upper part of the castle with torches held high. They kicked open Duke Tully's room, but the old duke who was shot in the chest had already died at this moment, completely dead, and even his body had gradually lost temperature. Then the rebels cut off Duke Tully's head, grabbed the hair, and held it high in their hands, passing it to each other like throwing a ball, and finally picked it up on the tip of the gun. Horse Tully is dead. Not far from Duke Tully's room, King Robert's bedroom was naturally besieged by a large number of rebels. But the captain of the King's Guard, Sir Barristan Selmy the Fearless, held a long sword and blocked the door alone. He was wounded in many places, but he still fought to the death and repelled several sieges of the rebels, like a god of war. After all, the entrance to the bedroom was so small that the advantage in numbers was compressed to a very small range. If they could not pass the level of the captain of the King's Guard, no one could hurt King Robert Baratheon. Who can kill me? Barristan Selmy's grey hair and beard were stained with blood, and his white robe was also stained with blood. He held a long sword and blocked the door. As a legendary knight known all over the world, he frightened the rebel soldiers so much that they were afraid to move forward. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 439, City on its Knees. However, at this moment, Sir Merintrent, a King's Guard standing behind the old knight, pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed it directly into the back of Barristan Selmy's neck from behind. The tip of the dagger pierced through the throat and then suddenly pulled it out. Puff, blood gushed out instantly, splashing on the face of the rebel soldier in front of him. The white knight's armor was stained with blood, and the long sword in Barristan Selmy's hand also fell to the ground with a clang. He covered his throat with one hand and looked unbelievable. He seemed to want to say something but said nothing. The blood rushed into his trachea and blocked his voice. The captain of the King's Guard never thought that his sworn brother, who he could trust with his back, would betray him in this situation. It turned out that Merintrent had already had a change of heart. He had already thought about running away when he saw that the White Walkers were unstoppable. However, he hesitated and did not take action until Viserys arrived with his dragon. Humans defeated the White Walkers and saved the world, but the conflict between Viserys and the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms was irreconcilable. Merintrent believed that Viserys wanted to kill people. He wanted to eliminate more nobles of the Seven Kingdoms, otherwise he would not come with a group of barbarians who were prepared to kill and burn. As Robert's King's Guard, Merintrent thought he was one of the people Viserys wanted to kill the most. But Sir Merintrent didn't want to die yet. He hadn't lived enough, so he had to do something to survive, and the greatest merit was to sell out his master for glory, capture the old king alive and offer him to the new king, or kill him. Since the king was shot and fell into a coma, Merentrant had made up his mind a long time ago, but the old man Biristan Selmy was always guarding the king's side, leaving Merentrant no chance to do it. However, now is the best opportunity. Merentrant suddenly turned against them and killed Biristan Selmy, who was just like a god of war, from behind. The rebels outside the door were still a little confused and stunned. There was a civil strife in Reveron. The number of rebels was limited, but the soldiers of the Tully family gathered more and more, so they quickly killed them up the stairs. Before the rebels caught King Robert, they rushed forward, and the two sides fought in the upper floors of the castle. Merentrant, the king's guard who had betrayed his oath, was also a little anxious when he saw this situation. He thought the outcome was almost certain, so he suddenly killed Biristan Selmy, but he didn't expect that there would be a change at this time. He rushed over and wanted to catch King Robert as a hostage, but was surrounded by the Tully family soldiers who rushed forward. Ding ding. As a member of the king's guard, Merentrant was naturally not a good person. He roared and waved his sword to kill two Tully family soldiers in succession. But he was outnumbered and was stabbed in the knee by a sword from behind. He immediately screamed in pain and fell to the ground. Then he was captured alive and tied up. Kill. The civil strife in Reveron was fierce. Both sides fought fiercely, and their eyes were red. It lasted for half a night, but in the end, the Tully family won. The blood flowed like a river and corpses were everywhere in Reveron. All the rebels died or were injured. Some were even forced to jump into the river. In the end, no one knew whether they swam out from the water gate or died under the arrows of the defenders. Several bodies of rebels were floating on the river. The Tully family soldiers were cleaning the battlefield and finally found the chopped head of Duke Tully, but it was difficult to recognize at this moment. The old duke's head was kicked around by the rebels like a bull and was finally found under the bed. When Edgemure saw his father's head and the headless corpse covered with footprints and filth, he became extremely angry. With red eyes, he ordered all the captured rebellious nobles to be sent to the gallows and hanged. The rebellion in Reveron was suppressed, and countless bodies of rebellious nobles were dragged down from the gallows and thrown into the kennel to feed the dogs. Merentrant, a sworn guard who was not a rebellious noble, escaped by luck. He was temporarily detained in the water dungeon of Reveron, enduring the pain of having his knee pierced, like digging out his thigh and cutting his flesh. The body of Sir Biristan Selmy, the captain of the king's guard who loyally protected the king until the last moment, and was a legendary knight famous in the Seven Kingdoms, was also properly collected. However, the strange thing is that King Robert Baratheon was temporarily placed under house arrest by the soldiers of the Tully family after the war, and he was not even allowed to mourn the body of Biristan Selmy. Although the rebellion was suppressed, the panic expressions on everyone's faces could no longer be concealed. Now it is past the hour of the bat, but the night is still thick. After half a night of turmoil in Reveron, the atmosphere has fallen into a weirdness. After the death of the old duke, his successor Edgemure Tully became the new generation of the Riverland Guardian and the Duke of Reveron. All the Riverland vassals who survived by chance collectively swore in the Hall of Reveron and expressed their loyalty to Edgemure Tully. Then the door of the Hall of Reveron was closed, and the new Riverland Guardian and all the Riverland vassals closed the door to discuss something, and discussed for half a night in one breath. The sky gradually turned pale, and the dawn of a new day was about to come. The gate of Reveron suddenly opened, and the towering drawbridge was lowered. Edgemure Tully, who claimed to be the guardian of the Riverlands and the Duke of Reveron, led all the Riverlands vassals to Viserys' warhorse, and knelt down to surrender. He took the initiative to hand over the false King Robert Baratheon who was recovering in the city, and asked Viserys to forgive his father Hoster and the Tully family for their crimes, and to allow him to bury his father. The turmoil in Reveron last night also alarmed Viserys outside the city, but he didn't know what happened in the city. However, he didn't expect that so many things would happen after a night of turmoil. Viserys looked at Edgemure Tully kneeling in front of his warhorse, and behind him were the Riverlands vassals and soldiers of the Tully family who survived the turmoil. Finally, he nodded slightly and told Edgemure that he could still leave Reveron to the Tully family, but the title of Guardian of the Riverlands must be taken away from him. Edgemure's face was a little pale, but he still had no objection. He had thought of this possibility a long time ago, but it was just difficult to accept it for the time being. Then the Dothraki rushed into Reverin and completely controlled the castle. Chapter 440, Rushing to King's Landing. Perhaps no moment in the history of the Seven Kingdoms has been as exciting as this one. Dragons, giants, Dothraki, and White Walkers all gathered on the land of Westeros to fight each other. On the contrary, the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms, the ancestors or the Andals, who claimed to be the masters of this land, many of whom were ancient bloodlines inherited from the heroic age thousands of years ago, were beaten and bloodied in this war. The human coalition defeated the White Walkers, and the alliance fell apart in an instant. The barbarians led by the remnants of the Targaryen broke through the Twins and Reverin all the way, and the nobles of the Riverlands surrendered. The Tully family also took the initiative to kneel and surrender under the fire and scimitars, and was stripped of the title of Guardian of the Riverlands by Viserys, and became an ordinary Earl family. The Tully family joined Aegon's army with the dragon banner raised in rebellion against King Heron's rule. They were eventually crowned as the Lords of the Riverlands by Aegon after the dragon set fire to Harrenhal. However, the Tully family's rule over the Riverlands came to an end in the hands of Viserys. Edmure Tully, the Duke, did not even hold the title for more than one night before he became Lord Edmure Tully, the Lord of Reverin. All the Riverland nobles who had sworn allegiance to him not long ago looked at him with some strange eyes. The Dothraki controlled the entire Reverin, and the king, who was under house arrest by the Tully family soldiers, naturally fell into Viserys' hands. Viserys looked at Robert. His mental state was not very bad. It seemed that he had not suffered too much from repeated betrayals and imprisonment. He was just angry about the death of Barristan Selmy, and he hoped that Viserys would order the execution of Meryn Trant, who had betrayed his oath. As for the upcoming fate of this person, Viserys felt that Meryn Trant didn't seem to understand clearly. No king would dare to use such a person as his Kingsguard. He was cruel and cunning, and his character was even worse than that of the Kingslayer. It was no wonder that Robert's Kingsguard was the worst in history. Meryn Trant killed Barristan Selmy from behind. His behavior not only did not help Viserys, but also discredited Viserys. It makes people wonder whether Meryn Trant has been in contact with him for a long time, but in fact, he did not. Viserys would not use such a person who betrayed his master for glory. Therefore, killing such a person is not enough to appease the public anger. Killing him can also cleanse Viserys of the stain on his body. The dragon lives in Reverin, under the joint witness of countless river nobles, Tully family soldiers, and Dothraki people. Meryn Trant was pressed down in front of Barristan Selmy's body for execution. The legendary knight who was murdered by a traitor, and was famous in the Seven Kingdoms, was buried with great ceremony after Meryn Trant was killed. He was buried in a beautiful place outside Reverin. A stone tablet was erected in front of his grave, on which was written the life story of Barristan the Fearless, and there was also a sentence written by Viserys himself in the common language. He was born a knight, and died a knight. After the Tully family surrendered, and Barristan Selmy was buried, a day passed in the blink of an eye. At night, Viserys lived in Reverin, and the master room where the old Duke Hoster lived before his death became Viserys' temporary bedroom. This magnificent bedroom is the most luxurious bedroom in the entire Reverin, and it has been cleaned by servants. There is no trace of war, and even the bloody smell of last night is gone in the air, but there is a bit of women's rouge fragrance. On the first night after the war, the nobles of the Riverlands, who had their own thoughts, were either panic-stricken or ambitious. Because everyone knows that the position of River Guardian is now vacant, and the former feudal lord has been demoted to an ordinary earl. If you want to seize this opportunity, just like the Tully family was reused by Aegon, and served as River Guardian for 300 years, now is the best time. His Majesty was resting in Reverin, and the river nobles began to have their own thoughts. They sent the wives and daughters of some defeated nobles, and even sent their own wives. One of them, a woman named Hildy, was the wife of a sworn knight under the command of Earl Titus Blackwood. She even tried to sneak into Viserys' bedroom in the middle of the night, but was caught by the Dothraki guards on duty outside the door. The restless night passed quickly. Although Viserys was a man of blood, he was not so hungry that he would eat anything. He did not favor any of the noble ladies who came to him on their own initiative, and more importantly, their looks did not quite meet his taste. The morning of the third day, Viserys was dressed with a metal dragon head emblem on his left chest and a black and red cape with velvet lining. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." He appeared in the hall of Reveron, and all the river nobles, including the new Lord Tully, sat down below with a respectful attitude. After a day's rest, Viserys will gather the army today and head straight to King's Landing along the river road, the main road suitable for the army to march. Because Arianne is pregnant, he changed his plan to conquer King's Landing first and ascend the Iron Throne, to occupy the name of Orthodoxy, and then launch a second conquest war to recover the entire territory. After getting married in the Cathedral of St. Bela, Viserys brought more than 20,000 Dothraki from Pentus. After two major battles with the White Walkers and the coalition forces, thousands of people were lost, and now only 18,000 people are left. However, in the Battle of Reveron, more than 20,000 coalition prisoners were captured in one go, and most of them chose to surrender and become a member of the Targaryen army. The size of Viserys' army doubled. When armor and food were insufficient, the nobles of the Riverlands generously donated money. In addition, the spoils of war, armor, weapons, etc. were collected from the coalition camp. Woo, then the melodious horn sounded, and the dragon flew in the sky and roared dully. Boom, boom. The two giants on the ground took heavy steps, and the ground trembled slightly with every step. "Our goal is that iron chair. Great Dothraki warriors, take it back for our Khal." Roar, roar. The sun rose in the sky, and the water of the Red Fork River was flowing quietly, as if it had washed away the blood of a few days ago. The Targaryen army was shouting, and horses were neighing. Countless Dothraki gathered on both sides, sandwiching the newly surrendered coalition soldiers. Rumble, the army marched, holding high the three-headed dragon flag of House Targaryen, and marched along the wide and flat river road from Reveron straight to King's Landing. Chapter 441, Siege of King's Landing. After the Battle of Reveron, Viserys did not continue to attack the Westerlands and the Vale as originally planned, but instead marched straight to King's Landing. In the distant capital of the Seven Kingdoms, the people in King's Landing were in panic. The city gates were closed. The number of soldiers on the city walls had even doubled. The streets and alleys were full of golden cloaks patrolling. Civilian supplies were under control and in short supply. The black market was rampant, and many ruffians were more arrogant than before. Why did King's Landing become so tense? The reason is simple. Now the Golden Corps, holding high the banner of dragon above, gold below, has surrounded King's Landing. Outside the city, there are not only soldiers of the Golden Corps, but also the famous Unsullied Army. The Targaryen Navy, under the command of Lord Geoffrey Bracken, has also blocked the entire Blackwater Bay. Dense warships of different sizes have covered the entire sea, surrounding King's Landing. A week ago, the eldest princess of the new dynasty, Rhaenys Targaryen, received a report from the twins on Dragonstone. The human coalition repelled the White Walkers, and then an internal conflict broke out. Viserys led his army to defeat the coalition of the Seven Kingdoms, and was leading the Dothraki southward towards Reveron. After receiving this intelligence, Rhaenys decided to cooperate with her brother to take the initiative. According to the original plan, she would fight in both directions, one north and one south. She personally led the Southern Army to attack the enemy's base camp, King's Landing. This was the biggest test for Rhaenys, because King's Landing, as the largest and most prosperous city in the Seven Kingdoms, has a very terrifying population size in this era, not to mention that countless people from the north and the Riverlands have fled in. Every day, I don't know how much resources are consumed just for eating, drinking, defecating, and urinating. If it is in a state of war, it will easily be transformed into tens of thousands of soldiers. Moreover, King's Landing also has towering walls, which are covered with trebuchets, giant crossbows and other terrifying war weapons. These were all prepared to fight against the White Walkers. The Seven Kingdoms mobilized their own productivity, united all the craftsmen, and worked overtime to produce them. Now, before they could be transported to the front line, the war between humans and White Walkers was over, and the next step was the war between humans and humans. The eldest princess of the new dynasty, Rhaenys Targaryen, personally led the army to surround King's Landing from three directions: land, sea and air, and the city of King's Landing was naturally highly tense. The Prime Minister John Arryn was dead, and Prince Joffrey Baratheon was still young, so the regent Queen Cersei Lannister completely controlled the government. They didn't know that King Robert had been defeated again and captured alive. In a study in Meagher's Tower in the Red Castle, Aerys Oakett, one of Robert's Kingsguards left in King's Landing, walked in hurriedly. "Your Majesty." The Kingsguard in white armor pushed the door and walked in, and then spoke in a hurried voice. However, he came too quickly and didn't knock on the door. He accidentally saw something he shouldn't have seen. Aerys Oakett's cheeks were slightly embarrassed, and he took a step back and lowered his head. Said Jaime. In the study of Meagher's Holdfast, Her Majesty the Queen and her brother, who was a member of the Kingsguard, were alone in a room. It seemed that their actions were not very elegant and easygoing. The blonde knight's face was not very good. He seemed to be slightly annoyed by the reckless actions of his sworn brother, but he didn't say much. The beautiful queen didn't care about her exposed chest. She tied her belt calmly, sat up from the table, and then stepped on the ground barefoot. She raised her delicate chin slightly and asked, "Sir Aerys, what happened? Since the War of the Usurper, there are many Kingsguard positions that need to be filled, and King Robert also feels that this matter is difficult. Queen Cersei Lannister promoted 5 people at once, based on some kind of political agreement, so this generation of Kingsguard is regarded by many as the worst generation of Kingsguard, such as Meryn Trant, who are not qualified to wear white robes." Aerys Oakett was also one of the Kingsguard promoted by Queen Cersei, so he turned a blind eye to what just happened. "Yes, Your Majesty." The White Knight heard the Queen's words and said respectfully, while holding the hilt of his sword, "Just now, Lord Janos Sterling, the Commander-in-Chief of the Capital Guard, sent a message that they suspected that they had caught a spy from the Targaryen family at the river gate. He smuggled in from the Fisherman's Square. It seems. Aerys Oakett was a little hesitant to say this, and looked at the two people. When Jaime Lannister heard him stumbling, he frowned slightly and spoke directly. "It seems." "What? Aerys, just say it." The White Knight looked at Jaime, and then at the Queen, then gritted his teeth and spoke. "It seems to be your dead brother, Lord Tyrion Lannister." "What?" Hearing the words of his sworn brother, the Blonde Knight was slightly stunned, and then suddenly stood up from the chair. His eyes stared at the other party, then strode forward, and looked into the other party's eyes, and asked again seriously, "Aerys, what did you say? Is it Tyrion?" After getting the other party's affirmative nod, Jaime couldn't bear it anymore. He pushed the other party away. He didn't even wear armor, just casual clothes, and hurriedly walked straight out of the door, while calling the servants in the Red Castle to prepare horses. He personally went to the Gold Cloak prison to visit his brother. The news of Tyrion's death had spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms a long time ago, and Jaime was upset for a long time when he received the news. He even used his sword to dig a cenotaph for his brother in the Godswood of the Red Keep to commemorate Tyrion. But he didn't expect to hear the news that Tyrion was still alive in such a situation where the army was besieged. This was the only bit of luck in a million misfortunes. The relationship between Jaime and Tyrion was very good. However, when Jaime rushed to the dungeon, he found that Tyrion was not imprisoned, but was living comfortably. The Commander-in-Chief of the capital garrison, Janos Sterling, was accompanying him. Tyrion crossed his legs and shook the red wine glass in his hand. It seemed that he had long thought that his brother would come, and he was waiting here quietly. Bang! The door was roughly pushed open by the Blonde Knight, and Jaime saw Tyrion sitting on the chair at a glance. Tyrion also saw him, and then Jaime strode over, and then the two brothers hugged each other tightly. "Tyrion, I'm glad you're alive." "Of course, Jaime, I'm better than anyone else." After the touching scene of the brothers meeting, Jaime asked Tyrion what happened. Why did his father say he was dead? And why did a dead man suddenly come back to life? And what is Tyrion's current identity? Why did Aerys say he caught a Targaryen spy? Jaime asked many questions in one breath, and Tyrion sat back in his seat, drank a sip of wine, waved his hand, and then began to tell the story. Chapter 442 Brothers Meet. The two brothers met again after a long separation, so naturally, what they said was not suitable for others to listen to, especially when the whole city was named Lannister. The Commander-in-Chief of the Capital Guard, Janos Sterling, respectfully withdrew from the room. Tyrion looked at Janice's receding back, shook the red wine glass in his hand slightly, and the crystal clear liquid exuded the mellow aroma of alcohol. Then he raised his head and drank it all, and then said, "This is a good dog." "Really, Jaime?" The White Knight heard Tyrion's words and also looked in the direction of the door and then nodded silently. Yeah. Janis Sterling was a greedy man who made the entire Capital Guard a mess, but he had one advantage, which was obedience. It was this advantage that allowed him to keep his current position and be reused. But even the most loyal dog will bite its master when it is about to starve to death. Tyrion sneered and spoke as if he meant something. What? Jaime Lannister frowned slightly when he heard this. He was not a fool and could naturally hear what Tyrion meant. Now that the Targaryen army was at the gates of the city, even if King's Landing temporarily summoned many mercenaries and free knights to help defend the city and captured able-bodied men to expand the military, it was still far from enough. That was a dragon. The girl who had escaped from King's Landing by chance now rode a bronze dragon and led a large army to surround King's Landing from 3 directions: land, sea and air. Jaime Lannister also climbed the city wall at that time and witnessed the appearance of the dragon with his own eyes. "Tyrion, what do you mean?" The handsome blonde knight tilted his head slightly and asked suspiciously, but was interrupted by Tyrion waving his hand. "Okay, let's not talk about this, Jaime. Let's talk about something serious." Tyrion avoided talking about Janis Sterling's problem and changed the topic to talk about what happened not long ago. Speaking of this topic, Tyrion picked up the wine bottle and filled a glass of wine for himself, then drank it all and smacked his lips. Then he told the story of how he followed his father to the battle line of Kaelin Bay and was abandoned by his father. He survived the wildfire explosion and wandered aimlessly in the north. He was finally rescued by a group of soldiers who were separated in the Battle of Winterfell, including Benjen Stark. They were entrusted by a person who possessed mysterious power and called himself the Green Prophet to go find Viserys. The other party seemed to want to see Viserys, but for some reason he could not go there in person. Tyrion followed this group of people from the north, which had completely fallen into the dead zone of ice and snow, and found several small boats. Because of the lack of intelligence, they rowed all the way to Dragonstone. But Viserys was not here at all. They were caught by the soldiers of the Golden Company as spies and met the eldest Princess Rhaenys. Because he wanted to survive, Tyrion knelt down in front of Rhaenys and surrendered to the Targaryen family and promised to offer King's Landing to Her Royal Highness. Then Tyrion followed the Targaryen army to King's Landing. When he sneaked into the city through the mud gate, he was caught by the gold cloaks, and then there was the scene of the brothers meeting. Jaime was slightly stunned after hearing Tyrion's ups and downs. Tyrion's life during this period was even more exciting than the story. How could this be? He didn't want to believe that his father actually wanted to kill his brother. What he didn't want to believe even more was that Tyrion told him so openly that he had surrendered to the eldest princess and wanted to take King's Landing for her. "I know that you made such a promise because you were forced to do so." The handsome blonde knight was silent for a moment and then finally spoke. "No. However." Tyrion shook his head and spoke in a faint voice and once again raised the wine glass and drank a sip of the wine in the glass. Jaime's eyes suddenly narrowed slightly and an expression of unwillingness to believe appeared on his handsome face. He couldn't help but ask, "Why, Tyrion? Didn't you make this promise because you were forced to survive? This kind of promise doesn't count. Are you sure you can defend King's Landing?" Tyrion suddenly interrupted his brother at this time, put down his wine glass and asked. Jaime was slightly startled, then opened his mouth, but suddenly found himself speechless. Tyrion looked at Jaime, who suddenly didn't know what to say, with a sharp gaze, paused slightly, and then continued to ask, repeating the question just now. "Are you sure you can defend King's Landing, Jaime, under the dragon's flames?" Although I didn't see how Viserys defeated the White Walkers, I saw how the White Walkers destroyed humans. The burning flames were extinguished, the muddy swamps were flattened, all attributed to the Night King, who is more terrible than the gods I imagined. People were killed by the White Walkers, and then got up again, and it repeats over and over again. Tyrion's voice echoed in the room, but Jaime, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly interrupted his brother's words and spoke in a slightly raised tone. but I will die. Jaime Lannister looked at Tyrion with sharp eyes, raised his hand, and made a beheading gesture. You know, Tyrion, I killed his father. I killed his father. No matter what the reason is, do you think he will listen to my explanation? The blonde knight's emotions were slightly out of control. On the surface, he seemed to be indifferent to the title of Kingslayer, but in fact, this was one of the biggest stains in his life. And, Cersei, maybe you will suffer the same fate as me. Tyrion was silent for a long time after hearing his words. Then he sighed and shook his head and said, "That's what you want to say, Jaime. You care about Cersei even more than yourself." The White Knight was silent, pressing the hilt of the sword with one hand, and his 5 fingers were slightly white. Then Jaime didn't say anything more, but pushed the table and stood up from the chair. "In that case, Tyrion, you will stay here for the time being. I have asked for help from Renly Baratheon of Storm's End. The reinforcement from the Stormlands are on the way. Whether it is a dragon, a barbarian, or that brat, I will prove to you that I can defeat them." Speaking of Viserys, Jaime couldn't help but think of the second prince who was put on a carriage and sent out of King's Landing more than 10 years ago. At that time, he personally took the boy to the carriage, escorted the caravan out of King's Landing, and then returned. Viserys' eyes were full of he knows what happened. He knew everything. But he didn't cry like a 7-year-old child. Instead, he tried to control his emotions and make himself look calmer, but occasionally he still showed panic that he couldn't hide. It was for this reason that Jaime was deeply impressed by Viserys at that time. But he didn't expect that more than 10 years later, the boy he sent away personally came back and wanted to take his life. Jaime pressed the hilt of the sword with one hand, said this, and turned around and wanted to leave. He wanted to make himself look cool and confident, like the little kid back then, but he didn't expect the chair leg to become his obstacle. Bang! Jaime was tripped and almost fell down. He looked a little embarrassed, but he still left here without looking back. Tyrion looked at him, said nothing, picked up the wine glass from the table, and watched his brother leave. It seems that he had expected this result a long time ago. Jaime would not surrender easily. Chapter 443, Secret Talks at the Red Keep. That night, not long after Jaime Lannister left the dungeon of the Capital Guard. Gulululu, the sound of the wheels of the carriage rolling on the bluestone slabs. It rained lightly tonight, and the rain hit the roof of the carriage. The rain on the ground gathered into a stream and flowed to the deepest part of the alley. A carriage covered with black cloth stopped in front of the gate of the dungeon, picked up Tyrion, who was supposed to be temporarily detained here under Jaime's order, and left here, and then disappeared in the complicated streets of King's Landing. I have wondered which nobleman in King's Landing is serving the Targaryen family. Tyrion looked indifferent sitting in the carriage. Everything that happened at present was under his control, and the person sitting opposite the carriage did surprise him a little. But I didn't expect it to be you. Tyrion did not let go of the wine glass, but this time he did not drink, and his eyes were still a little complicated. The person sitting in front of him was the king's intelligence chief, Spider Varys. This bold eunuch, who was round and fat, had a rouge smell on his body, and wore brightly colored fine silk and soft shoes. However, these were not to satisfy his personal aesthetics or hobbies, but to hide his smell, the sound of his clothes and walking, so that others could not immediately recognize him when he changed his identity. Spiders have 8 legs, my lord. Varys, who was sitting opposite the carriage, heard Tyrion's voice, opened his eyes slightly, and then spoke calmly. He just mentioned it, and did not explain the meaning in detail. According to the news I received, the city is in danger. Viserys' army surrounded Riverrun. If our king or your father, Stannis or the Duke of Winterfell can suddenly show his bravery and defeat the dragons, Dothraki, and giants, perhaps our country can still be saved. Varys said in a faint voice. He received the intelligence earlier than the nobles in King's Landing. In fact, he released a lot of the intelligence on his own initiative. According to the intelligence Varys received, Viserys had surrounded Riverrun, but the follow-up intelligence had not yet been circulated. I never thought that a eunuch would worry about the country and the people. Tyrion sneered and said with a sarcastic voice. He was not in a good mood. He opened the curtain a little and looked at the rain outside the window. At this moment, the streets of King's Landing were dark, and only the sound of dripping rain could be heard. This most prosperous city in the Seven Kingdoms was under curfew because of the war. There were gold cloaks patrolling the streets, but they all turned a blind eye to the carriage. Dwarfs can think about national affairs, and eunuchs can naturally do the same. Hearing Tyrion's harsh voice, Varys responded calmly. One of the two parties is a eunuch and the other is a dwarf, and neither can look down on the other. In fact, I'm not serving the Targaryen family. Viserys may not even know my name. I'm doing this for myself. Varys and Viserys did not have much contact. He thought that Viserys should not have heard of his humble name. And Tyrion did not hear Rhaenys mention that King's Landing had a Targaryen family insider before meeting Varys. He looked at Varys with some surprise, not understanding why he did this. Not for the benefit, to be a good person. However, he knew that the eunuch's words could not be easily believed, and Tyrion narrowed his eyes slightly. Varys seemed to know that Tyrion did not believe him, and then spoke in a faint voice. The war is about to start. I don't know how many people will die in this city. The dragon's flames will burn King's Landing, just like the Mad King wanted to blow up King's Landing with wildfire many years ago. Varys glanced at Tyrion. I just want more people to survive. Gilululu. Then the carriage drove into the Red Castle, and the guards of the Red Castle silently made way. It turns out that the big shot who really wants to meet Tyrion tonight is none other than Cersei Lannister, the sister of Tyrion, the current queen who controls the government. The queen's other brother, Jaime Lannister, the commander-in-chief of the defense of King's Landing, is now on the top of the city in the drizzle. The place where Cersei and Tyrion secretly meet is in Meager's Holdfast, in Cersei's bedroom. There is no one here except Cersei's personal maid, not even the king's guard. Led by the maid, Tyrion hurriedly walked into the door and then saw the queen in a light yellow dress sitting quietly behind the dining table. At this moment, the table was full of food and red wine. There was still a little residue in Cersei's glass. It seemed that before Tyrion arrived, Cersei had been drinking alone for a long time. Cersei. Tyrion looked at the beautiful blonde queen, then stopped slightly and took the initiative to say hello. The maid who led him here bowed slightly, then left the room and closed the door gently. Actually, I don't want to see you at all, you know, Tyrion. Cersei sat at the back of the dining table and raised her delicate chin slightly, looking at her dwarf brother in front of her. There was no affection in her eyes, only indifference and even a little hatred. But when father said you were dead, Jaime dug at him for you in the God's Wood with a sword, and I shed a few tears for you in Meager's Tower. Tyrion was silent for a moment after hearing his sister's words. He looked into Cersei's eyes. He believed that she didn't need to lie about this issue. So after a long silence, he spread his hands. Then it seems that I should be grateful for the few tears you shed for me. He could feel the other party's complex emotions at the moment. She was holding up the surface scenery. She was the noble queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but in fact, the panic in her eyes could no longer be concealed, even worse than a 7-year-old boy, so she was so impatient to find Tyrion. However, Cersei still just snorted coldly on the surface, and then she didn't beat around the bush, and went straight to the point. I heard from Jaime that you have now surrendered to the Targaryen family. Are you the messenger of that Rhaenys? Tyrion nodded slightly, and admitted that Cersei was not going to beat around the bush. Yes, Her Royal Highness the Princess sent me to the city to persuade her to surrender. He kept silent. He used his head to make a promise that he would offer King's Landing to Rhaenys. Humph. When Cersei heard what Tyrion said, a sarcastic smile appeared on her beautiful face. Now you have become Her Royal Highness the Princess. You are indeed someone who would do such a thing, Tyrion. Cersei stood up from the chair with one hand on the table with a wine glass in her hand, and walked to the balcony. The drizzle outside the window was still dripping. The night of King's Landing was deep. The candlelight illuminated the white skin of the woman's neck, reflecting light slightly. Then the beautiful blonde queen drank the red wine in the glass, put the wine glass on the balcony, turned her head and spoke. In that case, I will not beat around the bush. Tyrion. If I'm willing to surrender the city and leave King's Landing intact, what terms will Viserys offer me? Chapter 444 Attack. The secret talk between Tyrion and Cersei lasted for a long time. Cersei was like a trapped beast. She tightly grasped King's Landing in her own hands and tied the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in King's Landing to her. She was a woman without the ability of men to fight for supremacy on the battlefield, and her self-proclaimed political skills were actually not that smart. But she stubbornly recognized one thing, that is, Viserys absolutely did not want to get a King's Landing with corpses everywhere and ruins everywhere. Otherwise, the soldiers of the Golden Group holding the banner of Fire Dragon above, gold below outside the city would have started the siege from the first day they arrived. This is the military flag modified by the Golden Group after joining the Targaryen camp. On a khaki flag, the emblem of the three-headed dragon representing the Targaryen family is on the top, and the golden skull symbol of the Golden Group is below. This symbolizes that the Golden Group surrenders to the Targaryen family, but still wants to maintain a certain degree of integrity. This is a little defensive psychology of the commanders of the Golden Company. They are afraid that they will be torn apart and slaughtered after joining the Targaryen camp. This is also one of the conditions for the Golden Company to join the Targaryen family for free. Although the Unsullied and the Golden Company are strong, it is not so easy to break through King's Landing. Under the candlelight swaying gently in the wind, Cersei gritted her teeth and said, "Viserys, I will only hand over King's Landing to him intact if he agrees to my conditions and does not kill Joffrey, Myrcella and Jaime. Being able to save the lives of her children and brother is her bottom line. She can't give up the lives of Joffrey, Myrcella and Jaime." In fact, as early as when Littlefinger Petty Baelish came back from Pentos, he brought good news. She didn't know the specific negotiation process of Petter and Viserys' secret talks because there was no way to make this matter public. But Littlefinger Petty Baelish swore to the beautiful queen that Viserys accepted her proposal. Littlefinger claimed that Viserys agreed as soon as he heard Cersei's name and even drooled over her and couldn't wait to take her to bed. Because he had heard the name of Queen Cersei's beauty and virtue on the other side of the Narrow Sea, and was called the most beautiful woman in the Seven Kingdoms, and Lyanna Stark was like the difference between the light of a torch and the rising sun. When Cersei heard Littlefinger's words, she was happy, but did not believe them all, and was a little skeptical. Because Petty's habit of lying was also known to everyone in King's Landing. The words of the octopus spider and Littlefinger are the least trustworthy in King's Landing. And he did not bring back any tokens to prove his words, and the Targaryen family did not take the initiative to contact her after that. Therefore, when the army of Dragonstone was approaching, Cersei chose to close the door and wait for the situation to change. Because her affair with her brother was exposed, Cersei ordered the murder of the Prime Minister Jon Arryn. Her other way was already blocked. Now the last way left for Cersei was to believe Petty Baelish's words. And now Tyrion's arrival is like a life-saving straw. The noble and beautiful queen looks calm on the surface and everything is under her control, but she hides her brother Jaime behind her back and hurriedly summons Tyrion to the Red Castle for a secret meeting, because she knows that Jaime is definitely unwilling to surrender. Tyrion and his sister Cersei's secret talk lasted until midnight, and no one knows the specific results of the negotiations. Then Janos Sterling, the commander-in-chief of the capital garrison, led more than 50 gold cloaks to raid Jaime Lannister, who had just finished patrolling, and went down the city wall, and his other sworn brother Aerys Oakett, and their entourage of the Red Castle guards. King's Landing was not quiet this night, and the drizzle above his head flew and splashed on the ground. The two men, wearing raincoats and white armor without family crests, walked down the steps of the city wall while chatting. The personal relationship between Jaime and Aerys was actually quite good, mainly because Jaime looked down on Meryn Trant, Boris Blount, Preston Grimfell and Mandon Moore. He thought that these four people did not have the qualities of a knight, and should not be called knights but killers. Although Aerys and the other four were promoted to the Five Kings Good by Cersei, except for Jaime and Barristan, Aerys was still better than them. When faced with something that was insulting to honor, such as slapping a girl, at least Aerys would protest first and then execute it, while the other four would not hesitate, regardless of good or bad. Jaime had just inspected the walls of King's Landing, found some loopholes and problems in the city defense, and ordered the soldiers to correct them. Yesterday he received a reply from Storm's End. Lord Renly said that he had learned about the siege of King's Landing and was willing to send some reinforcement to support King's Landing. With the help of reinforcement, James felt much more relaxed. At least the pressure in his heart was not so great. But for some reason, he couldn't help but think of what Tyrion said during the day. When a loyal dog is about to starve to death, it will bite its master back. What did Tyrion mean by this? Could it be that Janis Sterling, the commander-in-chief of the capital garrison, has secretly betrayed the Lannister family? How did Tyrion know? Janis Sterling has already contacted the Targaryen family? Should he take them down in advance? However, if he gave up his martial arts without any evidence, because of Tyrion's words, it would be too easy for the Targaryen family to deal with them. James slowly walked down the wall with one hand on the hilt of the sword. The armor on his body made a sound. His mind was a little distracted, and he didn't hear what Aerys said just now. At this time, on the main road that runs through King's Landing under the Gate of the Gods, a team of soldiers from the capital garrison held up torches in the distance, stepped on the rain, and wore thick woolen golden robes. Their armor, helmets, and weapons reflected the light, and they were walking towards this direction. James saw that this group of people still had one hand on the hilt of the sword, but he stopped slightly, and the smile on his face slowly disappeared. Because he saw that the leader of this group of golden robes was Janis Sterling, who he was just thinking about. What did he want to do with so many people here? Oh no. For some reason, James suddenly had a strong bad premonition in his heart, and then he suddenly drew his sword and roared loudly, "Run." Chapter 2 was written on the high-speed rail with a mobile phone. My mother had breast cancer last year. After chemotherapy, she was going to go to another place for the second surgery. I took a notebook with me. I had nothing to do in the hospital, and tried to write as much as possible, but the update may be unstable. Please forgive me if I can't write it. Sorry. Chapter 445, Attack on a Rainy Night. However, at this time, the gold robes on the opposite side had already launched an attack. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of powerful crossbows firing one after another in the rainy night. The crossbow arrows flashing with cold light penetrated the grey rain curtain and rushed straight over. Puff, puff, puff. In the drizzle, blood flowers bloomed, and in an instant, several red castle guards who followed James screamed and fell down one after another. Among them, 2 white knights with high martial arts reacted quickly. Alex Oka drew his sword and chopped left and right to cut off several crossbow arrows. On the other side, Jane rolled on the spot and hid outside the door of a closed tavern on the side of the street, using the boxes placed at the door as a cover. What do you want to do? Rebellion? Alex was shocked and angry, but under the light of the high raised torch, he was greeted by another crossbow arrow, which was nailed hard on the obstacle in front of him, and wood chips flew. Arizoka turned around and looked at James. There was no need to ask any more questions at this moment. The City Watch had no crossbows in their regular weapons. Only under unconventional circumstances could this powerful weapon be used from the arsenal. Damn Janis Sterling. I'm going to kill him. James spat fiercely. He believed that Janis Sterling, the commander-in-chief of the City Watch, had betrayed the Iron Throne and secretly joined the Targaryen family. He had never thought about whether this matter had any connection with his sister, let alone what role his brother Tyrion played in it. Kill. After a round of shooting, the guards of the Red Keep fell one after another, and the gold cloaks then rushed forward shouting slogans. Capture the Kingslayer alive. Catch Jaime Lannister. On a rainy night, the two sides fought in the street on the most prosperous main road in King's Landing, and there were sounds of metal colliding, and shouts of killing everywhere. Ding ding. A Red Keep guard in red armor killed a gold robe, but was immediately pierced by 3 or 4 spears. Blood flowed from his mouth and he fell into a pool of blood. Although the Red Keep guards brought by Jaime were well equipped and brave, they were outnumbered. There were too many gold robes, not to mention the crossbows, so the battle was one-sided from the beginning. The Red Keep guards were killed one after another, and Alex Okad was surrounded. The White Knight fought bravely, slashing left and right to kill several gold robes in succession, and he himself was seriously injured. Bang. Alex was stabbed in the abdomen by a gold robe holding a spear, and was nailed to a dirt wall behind him. Dust and blood flew in an instant. The White Knight groaned in pain, but he gritted his teeth and held the spear with one hand. Blood flowed out from his fingers, and the muscles of his arm trembled slightly, preventing the spear from stabbing in. Seeing Ares so brave, the golden robe holding the spear was also slightly stunned. However, at the moment he was stunned, Ares roared and threw the long sword in his hand directly through the throat of the golden robe. Puff! The golden robe was full of disbelief, but the body still lost all strength and fell softly. Ares then pulled out the spear stuck in his abdomen with his bloody hands, threw it aside, and picked up the long sword he threw out. The White Knight is worthy of being one of the most powerful knights in the world of the King's Good. Even though he was seriously injured, he still killed many golden robes. On the other side, Jaime Lannister was also not a good guy. There were even more golden robes falling beside him than Ares. However, the Kingslayer was not seriously injured. All the blood on his body came from the enemy. First, Jaime's swordsmanship was extremely superb, and he was also a well-known brave man in the Seven Kingdoms. Second, the enemy was much lighter on Jaime than allies, and they had been trying to capture him alive from the beginning. Cersei knew that her brother would never be willing to give up his military power and surrender obediently according to her arrangements. Because the two had argued about this issue many times and never reached a consensus, Jaime was very sad and thought that Cersei didn't care about his life. He betrayed his oath and became a Kingslayer in order to stop the Mad King from blowing up King's Landing. Now if he fell into the hands of the Mad King's son, how could he still survive? Cersei believed that King's Landing could not be defended. If she wanted to save the lives of Joffrey, Myrcella and Jaime, there was only one way. The worst result might be to put on black clothes, which was better than death. But Cersei underestimated Jaime's need for her, and he was willing to go through fire and water for this. The one-sided battle between the two sides finally showed the result. All the guards of the Red Castle were killed in the street. On the slippery street, Alex Oakert, a member of the King's Good, also died tragically on the battlefield, nailed to the spot by 6 spears. Jaime seized the opportunity and took advantage of the other party's idea of capturing him alive. He cut a bloody path and entered the alley in an attempt to escape. Chase. Catch the Kingslayer. The commander-in-chief of the capital garrison, Janos Sterling, was anxious when he saw this scene. The most important target escaped, and he had no way to report to the Queen. He let Jaime escape too much, so Janos Sterling hurriedly ordered everyone to chase him. Remember, catch him alive. At the same time, he did not forget to emphasize again that he must be caught alive and not hurt Jaime. Her Majesty the Queen only meant to detain the other party. If Jaime became a corpse and was carried back, Janos Sterling was afraid that the Queen would twist his head off. Chase. Don't run. Then, the two chased and fled, passing through the demoulins of King's Landing. Jaime himself was a good martial artist and strong, and he turned around and disappeared in the darkness. Huh? Where is he? The gold cloaks lost Jaime and stood at the intersection of 6 alleys, a little overwhelmed. On the other side, the mercenary Bronn, who was found by Tyrion in advance, and his companion Chijon were ambushed on the road leading from the Gate of the Gods to the Red Castle. They were waiting to rescue a fat sheep who was captured by the gold cloaks and worth 100 gold dragons, and then kill all the gold cloaks and send him to the East Continent. Unfortunately, the scheduled time has arrived, and even exceeded it by a lot, but there is still no sign of the target mentioned by the employer. If the employer had not paid a huge sum of 30 gold dragons in advance, they would even think they were fooled. What the hell is going on? The mercenary Chijon said impatiently, hiding in the dark. On the other side, Bronn, with black hair and messy stubble, glared at him. Shut up. Keep waiting. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 446, Turmoil in King's Landing. It was drizzling tonight, and the dark sky was moonless. Under the cover of night, King's Landing now implemented a strict curfew system, so the battle on the street did not cause too much chaos. Quick, this way. Only the citizens of King's Landing who lived near the Gate of the Gods saw through the cracks in the door and the gaps in the curtains. They saw the golden cloaks holding torches and cleaning the messy battlefield. Hurry up. Move quickly. Bang. The bodies of the Red Castle guards were dragged away, loaded onto carts, and covered with a layer of black cloth. Blood was splattered on the ground, dripping along the wooden boards to the ground, and then crushed into the mud by the carriage. There was even a body of a King's Guard among them, but it was unknown which knight it belonged to. The citizens of King's Landing who witnessed all this hid in their rooms and trembled, not daring to breathe, for fear of causing some fatal disaster. What they knew was that they might have witnessed a horrific palace coup involving the princes and ministers of the kingdom, which was not something that they, the common people, could consider. Under the leadership of Janice Sterling, the Capitol Guard followed the order of Her Majesty the Queen and attacked the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense of King's Landing, and also the Queen's brother, King's Guard Jaime Lannister. The Queen demanded that the other party's personal safety must be guaranteed and that he be controlled and stripped of his military power. But Janice Sterling was incompetent and messed up this seemingly simple thing, allowing Jaime to fight his way out and successfully escape, and disappeared without a trace. Queen Cersei was furious when she heard about this and ordered to continue searching for her brother's whereabouts and at the same time control all the troops in the capital so as not to fall into a state of loss of control at this critical moment. That night, teams of fully armed gold cloaks holding torches began to search the King's Landing, hoping to find the whereabouts of the missing Jaime Lannister. Here, kick the door open. Bang. Janice Sterling, the commander of the Capitol's Guard, waved his hand, and the gold cloaks kicked open the door of a house suspected to be hiding the King's Guard, and then rushed in. However, the gold cloaks did not find Jaime among them, only the frightened screams of the owner of the house. On the other side, the mercenaries that Tyrion had hired at a high price to rob the prisoner car were also a little at a loss. They were not dignitaries in the throne room, and they didn't know what had happened. They felt that these gold cloaks were searching for someone all over the city like crazy. The mercenary Bronn also realized that something was wrong. He had killed people before he was 12 years old, and he was also an experienced pragmatist with no morals. He sensed that the situation was not good and decisively gave up the idea of completing the commission to get more gold dragons. Although Tyrion had paid him 30 gold dragons, this could not allow him to stay here at a greater risk. Let's go. Finally, the thin man with a ferocious face like a hungry wolf, looking at the increasing number of gold robes outside and the increasingly chaotic situation, finally gritted his teeth and said, "Quickly retreat." However, it was too late. A sharp-eyed gold robe holding a torch found them. "Stop. What are you doing? King's Landing has a curfew system. If it were in normal times, 3 or 5 mercenaries with long swords and short knives might not be paid attention to, but in this special period, there should be no one else in the middle of the night, and Bronn and others are particularly eye-catching." The gold robe found them and shouted loudly. His voice alarmed more soldiers of the capital garrison, and a group of people surrounded them with spears in their hands. Oops. When Bronn saw that things were not going well, his eyes turned slightly, and then he decisively abandoned his companions and went directly into a dark alley. The mercenaries had no resistance at all. Although they were more fierce than the gold cloaks, there were too many of them. Seeing Bronn turn around and run away, they decisively followed and fled. However, Bronn reacted quickly and left first, while the other mercenaries reacted a little slower. Although the gold cloaks were not strong in combat, they had more weapons and equipment and more people than the mercenaries. So Bronn's companions died or were injured, and only he escaped with his own skills and disappeared without a trace. This was just a small episode tonight. For the capital garrison, they just searched for Jaime Lannister's traces and eliminated a team of disobedient mercenaries. Tonight is destined to be a sleepless night. The gold cloaks dug 3 feet into the ground to find the whereabouts of the Queen's brother. Bronn felt that he had been betrayed by Tyrion and was looking for him all over the world to settle accounts, demanding more money to pay for the lives of his loved ones, relatives, brothers, and sisters. On the other side, in a corner of King's Landing Flea Bottom, this is the flower street of Rhaenys Hill going down to the west. The roads in Flea Bottom are as complicated as a maze, and the stench from pig pens, stables and tannery shops is mixed with the smell of wine cellars and brothels. The disappeared Jaime had changed his blood-stained white armor and changed into a golden robe that half covered his cheeks. At this moment, he was looking at the naked male corpse in front of him with a gloomy face and remained silent. He had just caught a lone soldier of the Capitol Guard and then dragged him here. pried open his mouth, and asked what happened, but the answer James got made his heart cold in an instant. He thought it was Janis Sterling who betrayed the Iron Throne and the Lannister family, because his brother Tyrion had already meant it. But he didn't expect to learn from the Golden Cloak that it was the Queen who ordered his arrest and the removal of all military power. Cersei decided to surrender to the Targaryen army, but Jaime had a fierce quarrel with Cersei and refused to hand over his military power, which became an obstacle to the surrender. On the other hand, Tyrion, who was supposed to be imprisoned in the dungeon of King's Landing, had already left there by car. Cersei. Tyrion's breathing was slightly heavy. He suddenly felt that he had been betrayed by the whole world. Even his sister and brother betrayed him. Didn't they really know that he would die after surrendering? However, King's Landing was in danger, and he didn't have much time left. The noise not far away was getting closer and closer, and the handsome blonde knight didn't keep silent for too long. The Red Castle could no longer be returned, so where should his next stop be? Casterly Rock. Jaime looked up at the sky above his head, which was gradually turning pale, and then wiped the rain and tears from his face. He was wearing a golden robe, armor, and clothes, and then he held a spear and hurriedly walked away. Chapter 447, Bloodless Battle. The spring drizzle still did not stop, but after a night of hustle and bustle, the sky was already dawning. Rumble. The gates of King's Landing suddenly opened. The Gate of the Gods, which was directly controlled by the capital garrison, had a road leading directly to the Red Castle. The streets were full of troops. A huge figure passed over the head of King's Landing, and the roar of the dragon awakened this sleeping magnificent city. Ho! The bronze-scaled dragon regal hovered in the sky, stretched his wings and roared again. Dragon. Oh my god. The golden robes below looked up at the sky, their legs trembling slightly. The citizens of King's Landing did not sleep well that night. They instinctively believed that something big must have happened last night, otherwise these golden robes would not have searched everywhere like crazy all night. But when the sun rises, what happened last night will be revealed. However, the truth they are waiting for has not yet arrived, and the roar of the dragon first came from the sky above King's Landing. The citizens of King's Landing hid in their homes and trembled. Those who had cellars in their homes had already entered them. They thought that the Targaryen army led by Rhaenys was ready to attack the city after besieging King's Landing for several days. However, they did not expect that the queen would order the city gates to be opened to welcome the Targaryen army into the city. The elephants of the Golden Company walked in the front, covered with heavy armor, with gold decorated on the ivory, and walked forward with heavy steps. Hoo 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 hoo. The soldiers of the Golden Company, wearing bright golden armor, holding weapons in their hands, followed the elephants in neat steps, and entered the Gate of the Gods. The flag of the three-headed dragon and the golden skull fluttered in the wind. Under the flag, the commander-in-chief of the Golden Company, Misthoin, rode a tall horse, also wearing golden armor and a long sword tied around his waist. At this moment, he was looking around the magnificent capital of the Seven Kingdoms. He saw the terrified eyes of the people in the houses on both sides of the street. To the people, the warriors of the Golden Group were not going home, but naked invaders. I didn't expect King's Landing to be like this. Misthoin held the reins with one hand, swaying slightly with the bumps of the warhorse, and then sighed. The Toyne family was once a family in the Stormlands. The family motto was fly far away, but they didn't expect to really fly far away to the continent of Essos, and only today they were able to return again. I didn't expect King's Landing to be like this. I smelled this disgusting smell outside the city. A fat man with sparse hair who was half a step behind Misthoin, and also riding a warhorse complained. His name is Harry Strickland, the butler of the Golden Group, in charge of the Golden Group's finances, and Misthoin's veritable right-hand man. At this moment, Harry pinched his nose with one hand and looked bitter. The population of King's Landing is quite dense, and the sewage facilities are old, and cannot support such a large population. Therefore, compared with other cities, it is a dirty and messy place. The smell of feces and urine can be smelled from a long distance. The biggest impression of King's Landing for everyone who has just seen this city is this disgusting smell. Obviously, Harry, the patriarch of the Strickland family, who is known as the 4 generations of loyalty to the Golden Group, is naturally the first time to come to King's Landing. He really saw the smell of feces and urine, and was deeply conquered. However, although the soldiers of the Golden Group all looked embarrassed, the unsullied soldiers following behind them had firm faces and did not change their expressions. They seemed not to smell the smell. They also marched into the city of King's Landing in an orderly manner. Seeing the Targaryen army marching into the city of King's Landing with strong men, the soldiers of the King's Landing's capital garrison, the strong men, free knights and mercenaries that Jaime temporarily recruited all looked at each other. At this moment, they were all forced to stand on both sides of the road to welcome, and then they couldn't help but lower their heads and throw away their weapons with a clang. Go. Confiscate all weapons. Take off your armor and put it over here. Line up and stand here. Under the command of Miss Toyne, the soldiers of the Golden Company quickly took over the defense of King's Landing. They controlled all the defenders of King's Landing, including the gold cloaks, confiscated their weapons and armor, and temporarily restricted everyone's personal freedom. The commander-in-chief of the Golden Company tended to use troops cautiously. Although the gates of King's Landing were wide open, he did not take it lightly. He still took one step at a time to ensure the safety of himself and his brothers and prevent the Lannister queen and the dwarf from suddenly using any conspiracy. After entering the city, the Targaryen army took every step carefully and gradually took over the entire city step by step. The princess who had attacked Dragonstone and surrounded King's Landing was still not showing up, which puzzled many intelligence personnel who were secretly observing. Then the soldiers of the Unsullied surrounded the Red Keep, and the gates of the Red Keep were closed. Queen Cersei hoped to prevent the Unsullied from entering the Red Keep and temporarily maintain the peace of the palace, fearing that Prince Joffrey and Princess Myrcella would be frightened. However, Cersei's insistence did not last long. When the Green Dragon Regal landed on the top of the Red Keep, bricks and rubble fell down, and a deafening roar was heard. The gates of the Red Keep were completely opened. The cute little blonde Princess Myrcella was frightened and cried on the spot, and Prince Joffrey was also frightened and pale, hiding behind his mother and trembling, because the dragon's tail was hanging outside the door of the throne room. Control the gate. Check the house over there. The commander of the Unsullied, Blackworm, loudly commanded his brothers in Valyrian. The soldiers of the Unsullied Legion were also disciplined. They did not rob the wealth in the Red Keep, nor did they touch the frightened women in the palace. They quickly controlled the Red Keep inside and outside. Almost all the guards of the Red Keep also willingly laid down their weapons, and those who dared to resist were mercilessly stabbed to death by the Unsullied. As for Robert's only two remaining Kingsguards, Boris Blount and Preston Grenfell, they did not resist. They had also heard about what happened last night. Jaime disappeared, and Aerys was besieged and killed by the Gold Cloaks, so they naturally knew the situation very well. There was a noisy chaos outside the throne room. The beautiful blonde queen held her daughter in her arms and sat on the Iron Throne with her son Joffrey. She tried hard to calm herself down, but her pale face and slightly trembling hands still exposed her nervousness, especially when the soldiers of the Golden Company reported to Miss Toyne. When they found a large number of wildfires scattered in King's Landing, the tension on her face was almost difficult to conceal. Chapter 448 Controlling the King. This is a large amount of wildfire produced by humans to resist the White Walkers. However, there was a batch of wildfires produced before they could be transported to the battlefield, and the war between humans and the White Walkers ended. Cersei had originally decided that, if Viserys decided not to spare the lives of Joffrey, Myrcella and Jaime, she would order the wildfires to be ignited and perish together with the Targaryen army. But she did not expect that the wildfires would be found before Viserys himself arrived in King's Landing. My lord. In the throne room, a soldier of the Golden Company reported to Miss Toyne about the discovery of the wildfire storage. Miss Toyne was not surprised after hearing this, but just nodded slightly. He told the soldiers to properly handle the wildfires, send heavy troops to guard them, and strictly guard them, not allowing anyone to approach, and move them outside the city at night. Although the Golden Company did not participate in the war between humans and the White Walkers, the news that the coalition forces used wildfires to resist the White Walkers had already spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms. This weapon is extremely powerful, and the green flames produced after the explosion are enough to burn everything to ashes. There are even rumors that after the White Walkers retreated, the coalition did not continue to pursue across the neck to retake the north. because the explosion at the Bay of Kalin was too powerful and destroyed the causeway that could ensure that the army could cross the neck. Therefore, the army's hope of retaking the north was blocked. Later, a civil war broke out among humans because of the struggle for power, which extinguished the faint hope of retaking the north by sea and the cradle. Mistoin had long heard of the name of wildfire and had been on guard against the possible wildfire stored in King's Landing before entering the city. Therefore, soldiers were sent to conduct a thorough search and finally found some in a hidden cellar. But this was definitely not all the wildfire, and there was still storage in King's Landing. The ugly commander-in-chief of the Golden Group with a big nose raised his head and looked at Queen Cersei, who was sitting on the Iron Throne with a pale face. The beautiful queen, who was elegant and noble in the past, looked a little nervous at this moment. After all, her conspiracy and tricks had been exposed. Tyrion, who was standing not far from Cersei, sighed slightly when he saw this scene. Cersei did not tell Tyrion in advance that she had secretly stored wildfire. She only warned Tyrion that, if Viserys could not spare Jaime's life, she would make the Targaryen family pay the price. But what Tyrion did not expect was that his sister actually took such a crazy approach of trying to drag the whole city to death together. But Cersei did not want Jaime to die, and so did Tyrion. Tyrion also did not tell Cersei that he had hired a group of mercenaries to try to rob the prisoners, so that Bronn and others could seize the opportunity to secretly transfer Jaime out of King's Landing, and then wait for an opportunity to send him to the East Continent. But unfortunately, this matter was also messed up. Jaime took advantage of the opportunity that the Gold Cloaks did not dare to kill him, and decisively killed a bloody road and escaped. So far, no one has been seen alive or dead, and even Tyrion and Cersei don't know where he went. Tyrion actually didn't distrust Cersei and was afraid that she would leak the secret, but the fewer people who knew about this, the better. Otherwise, once this matter was linked to him, Tyrion would not be able to escape death. Therefore, Cersei concealed Tyrion, and Tyrion also concealed Cersei. The last two Lannisters in King's Landing were still wary of each other, and the final result was naturally a mess. Lord Mistoyne. Perhaps it was because Cersei said that she had shed 2 tears for him. After sighing, Tyrion took the initiative to stand up and speak for his sister. The storage conditions of wildfire are extremely harsh. It must be stored underground without sunlight. Therefore, there are many storage points underground in King's Landing, and many of them are wildfires left over from the previous king's time, and they have not been found yet. The previous king mentioned by Tyrion here refers to Viserys' father, Mad King Aerys Targaryen II. Aerys created many wildfires, and there are still storage points that have not been found yet. Tyrion was afraid that Mistoyne would put the blame on Cersei, so he explained it in advance. Mistoyne nodded slightly. He had sent soldiers to capture the head of the Pyromancer Guild and asked him to cooperate in finding where the remaining wildfire was stored. At this time, footsteps and the sound of unsullied soldiers tapping their spears suddenly came from outside the throne room of the Red Keep. Your Highness, Your Highness. Many of the nobles in the throne room, as well as Tyrion, Cersei and others, all looked slightly tense. They knew who was coming. Boom boom. Then the door of the throne room was pushed open by 2 unsullied guards, and a brown-haired girl in military uniform strode in with one hand on the hilt of the sword. Behind her were several women and children with panicked expressions. They were the wife and daughter of Stannis, the Duke of Dragonstone, the survivors of the Valerian family, and the adopted son of Rosby. The Targaryen army came from the sea and swept across the king's territory. Rosby naturally fell into their hands first. Earl Giles wanted to stay indoors, but he was burned to death by Rhaenys riding a dragon. Cersei, who was sitting on the Iron Throne, saw Rhaenys striding in. Her palms were full of sweat. She wanted to maintain the majesty of the queen and retain her last dignity. But when the eyes of the new conqueror looked over, Cersei could not bear the psychological pressure after all. After all, she was surrounded by Targaryen soldiers. At this time, Cersei might regret being rescued so easily and surrendering the city, but if she refused to surrender, she might end up with a worse result. Then the beautiful blonde queen hugged her daughter and pulled Joffrey to stand up from the Iron Throne, resisting the humiliation in her heart and bowing slightly. Your Highness. Then she retreated to the side in disgrace, making way for the Iron Throne. Venus ignored Cersei. She stood at the bottom of the steps, looking at the throne made of thousands of swords above, and remained silent. This is a piece of iron covered with spikes, sharp horns and twisted metal, but it attracts countless people. Venus is still young, but she grew up in such a special family, and has a deep understanding of power. The brown-haired girl said nothing, holding the hilt of the sword with one hand, and stepped up the steps step by step. The custom-made women's armor on her body made a metallic sound. She walked past Cersei, but didn't even look at her. Prince Joffrey, who was not much younger than her, couldn't help trembling because of fear. Venus came to the Iron Throne, reached out and touched the cold iron lump covered with spikes, and then finally spoke in Valyrian without looking back. Take off her crown. Chapter 449 Ascending the Iron Throne. Cersei was slightly stunned. She didn't understand High Valyrian, but before she could react, two unsullied soldiers came forward and took off the crown on her head. The unsullied soldiers held spears and had cold eyes. This time, not only did they scare Myrcella to tears, but also Prince Joffrey. The blonde boy didn't understand what they said and thought that these cold-faced foreign soldiers were going to kill him. He was almost scared to wet his pants. But he didn't expect that they just came forward and took off the crown on his mother's head. Cersei screamed, and the crown was taken off, and she stood there with her hair disheveled. The last bit of dignity she had left on her body was gone, and she was completely indistinguishable from everyone else. The Targaryen army has taken over the entire city of King's Landing. Members of the Imperial Council and nobles who are qualified to attend the throne room are arriving one after another. The fat archbishop in the Cathedral of St. Bela is also on the scene. Cersei's crown was roughly stripped by the unsullied soldiers. She came to the side of Her Royal Highness the Princess with the crown in her palm. Rhaenys sat on the Iron Throne without hesitation in her bright armor, and looked at the fat archbishop and gorgeous clothes in the panic-stricken crowd below. The archbishop immediately understood, tremblingly walked out of the crowd, walked up the steps to the Iron Throne, and took the queen's crown from the unsullied soldiers. Then, under the warning of Blackblood not to act rashly, the fat archbishop trembled and put the queen's crown on Rhaenys. Seeing Rhaenys wearing the crown, there was a sparse applause from below. These vassals who belonged to the Baratheon family in the last second can cheer for the princess of the Targaryen family in the next second. Only Cersei, who was stripped of her crown and stood there in embarrassment, had a hint of resentment in her eyes. Rhaenys looked around at all the people standing below, including the ministers, the nobles of the royal domain, the families of the broken castle, Lady Stark and her children. She didn't care whether they cheered or resented. Then the girl sitting on the Iron Throne with the crown on her head spoke. Lady Florent, you will settle down here temporarily. Lady Selise Florent, who was holding her daughter Shireen below, naturally had no complaints. During this period of time with Rhaenys, she could also feel that this girl was not as cold and ruthless as she looked, but because the dragon was always around her, she seemed a little difficult to approach. Thank you, Your Highness. Thank you, Your Highness. Then Lady Florent and the families of Tidehead Island bowed slightly, and then followed the soldiers to retreat. They would settle down in the Red Castle temporarily and wait for the arrangement of fate. Lady Florent and others left, and the golden-haired queen and her two children were still standing alone on the steps, and the little princess Myrcella was still crying. Rhaenys frowned slightly, feeling somewhat reluctant, because she was probably Myrcella's age when she escaped from King's Landing. She glanced at Cersei and then spoke. Cersei Lannister, the wife of the usurper, I know the conditions you proposed, but I can't agree to you for the time being. Cersei's conditions were to spare the lives of Joffrey, Myrcella and Jaime, and to keep the Lannister family. Rhaenys couldn't agree to these on behalf of Viserys. More importantly, Lannister did not surrender, and was said to be still besieged in Riverrun. These would have to wait until Viserys returned to make a decision, whether to kill, keep, or other ways to deal with them. But for now, Rhaenys could temporarily let Cersei and her two children live in Meagher's holdfast. After all, the other party handed over King's Landing intact, so they could still enjoy this treatment. Cersei's hair was disheveled after her crown was taken off. She was holding a crying girl and a son who almost peed his pants. Standing on the throne room was like being pricked by needles. It was naturally more than she wanted when Rhaenys allowed her to go down first. Thank you, Your Highness. Cersei gritted her teeth slightly, looked at Rhaenys deeply, and tried hard not to let the tears flow down her red eyes. Then she bowed slightly, and spoke in a hoarse voice. Then she left the throne room under the escort of the unsullied soldiers, and returned to Meager's holdfast at the back. When the group of women and children left, Rhaenys retracted her gaze, and then turned her head to look at the little devil standing on the steps of the throne room without any sense of existence. Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion had been standing on the steps. He was not one of the nobles who knelt, and he did not seem to belong to the Targaryen family. He was just a worker, so his position was a bit awkward. Your Highness. Fortunately, Rhaenys had not forgotten him. Tyrion heard the girl's voice, and quickly stood up, bowing slightly. You have fulfilled your promise to me, and captured King's Landing without a single soldier, and I will naturally not break my promise. The brown-haired girl looked at Tyrion and blinked. When she first caught this little man, she never thought that he could really capture King's Landing without a single soldier. Rhaenys sent Tyrion out just to try, but she didn't expect to get a surprise. From today on, you are free, and you will no longer be held accountable. After hearing Rhaenys' words, Tyrion breathed a sigh of relief. In his view, it was an inevitable trend for the Targaryen family to seize the Seven Kingdoms, and he was a member of the Lannister family, one of the most unforgivable people, and his future was originally bleak. But now with the words of the eldest princess, Tyrion put down most of his heart. Although he had never met Viserys, through his understanding during this period of time, he knew that Viserys loved Rhaenys very much, and would listen to her opinions on many things. With Rhaenys' guarantee, it was basically a golden ticket to avoid death, and Viserys would not easily execute him. However, although he became a free man, and could go wherever he wanted, Tyrion did not want to leave, because he had no other place to go after leaving King's Landing. His father wanted to kill him, and he would not be recognized if he returned to the family. It would be better to stay in King's Landing, where there was someone who appreciated his talents, plus the bright future of the Targaryen family. Tyrion was moved. Your Highness. Then Tyrion spoke and expressed his thoughts. He wanted to stay in King's Landing. The nobles in the throne room immediately sneered, and even Catelyn shook her head. Some people thought that Tyrion was overestimating his own abilities. How could Her Royal Highness keep a dwarf in the court? However, what people did not expect was that Rhaenys was not surprised when she heard Tyrion's words, but showed a happy expression instead. She does recognize Tyrion's talents, and tells him that, if he wants to stay, she is willing to recommend him to Viserys. Chapter 450, The Pentis Conspiracy. But in the end, Rhaenys thought about it, and asked a question. Tyrion, I heard that the Kingslayer was attacked and disappeared last night. This should have nothing to do with you, right? The Kingslayer killed the king he swore allegiance to. After the Targaryen army entered King's Landing, they naturally searched for Jaime Lannister's whereabouts. Then they learned the news last night. Cersei wanted to remove Jaime's military power, and sent the capital garrison to attack and detain the other party, but Jaime killed a bloody way and escaped. Jaime is now missing, and Rhaenys naturally received this information after entering King's Landing, but there is no other way except to increase the search. When Tyrion heard Rhaenys' words, his expression was slightly stern. He did have such an idea before, hiring mercenaries to attack the prisoner car, and then sending Jaime to the East Continent to create the illusion of being attacked. But the final result was full of surprises, and Jaime's disappearance really had nothing to do with Tyrion. So the little devil stood on the steps in front of the Iron Throne and shook his head solemnly, denying it flatly. No, Your Highness. I didn't know about Jaime's disappearance either. Among the ministers in the audience, Intelligence Minister Varys put his hands in his sleeves and looked deeply at Tyrion's back on the steps, but kept silent. The Targaryen army captured the capital of the Seven Kingdoms, King's Landing, without bloodshed, and Princess Rhaenys temporarily sat on the Iron Throne. Then a series of orders came out from the Red Castle. First, there was a ban on King's Landing, which continued Cersei's curfew system. Secondly, a wanted order was issued to hunt down the king killer Jaime Lannister. As long as his trace was found, a bounty of 100 gold dragons could be collected, and if he was captured alive, there would be a reward of 1,000 gold dragons. Then he ordered Grand Maester Purcell and the High Bishop to inform other lords and vassals of the 7 kingdoms in the name of the Iron Throne and the 7 gods respectively that King's Landing had changed hands, and ordered them to surrender immediately. During this period, the situation in Westeros was changing rapidly. Relatively speaking, Essos became much quieter, except for several Dothraki civil wars that broke out on the Great Grass Sea. In the distant V's Dothraki, on the shore of the womb of the world, a hero who unified the Dothraki seemed to have risen. During this period, the Dothraki were in a civil war, and did not harass the free cities at all. The free cities had a peaceful life. In Pentos, the Perlin laid on the Bay Viserys' base camp, a conspiracy was secretly going on. The Tattered Prince secretly summoned a group of mysterious guests in the prince's palace. They were once the powerful class of Pentos, including the governor's family and the ancient Pentos nobles. They had wealth that could rival a country. It was said that the bathing pool was full of milk, and even the toilet for shitting was made of pure gold. However, all this disappeared after Viserys came. After the cleansing of the Bloody Night, the survivors of these families resented Viserys and the Tattered Prince. Their wealth is naturally not only stored in Pentos, so these ancient nobles and governor families joined forces in the foreign countries to secretly form a revenge organization in the hope of regaining their homes in the future. At this time, through the matchmaking of a certain force, the Tattered Prince and the other party started contact, and threw out olive branches to each other. The Tattered Prince explained to these remnants of Pentos nobles the reason for the Bloody Night that year, indicating that he was originally a member of noble blood. If Viserys had not forced him to take action, how could he have killed his compatriots? The Tattered Prince wanted to be a real prince, and the remnants of Pentos nobles hoped to restore the status and wealth of their families in Pentos in the past, so the two sides hit it off. Because they had made several contacts before, this time Viserys went on an expedition to the 7 kingdoms, and took away most of the Pentos troops. This was naturally the best opportunity. The Tattered Prince and many family representatives gathered in the prince's palace to plot to overthrow the rule of Pentos. The Tattered Prince secretly contacted many former members of the Windblown and promised them high interest. Some of these people were dissatisfied because they did not receive the treatment they imagined after surrendering to the Targaryen family. As their former leader, the Tattered Prince naturally knew these people very well. He took advantage of their dissatisfaction and greed, and took the opportunity to lure them with generous benefits and a bright future. On the other hand, these governors and noble remnants who still had considerable financial resources hired a lot of mercenaries and free riders to sneak into Pentos secretly. They wanted to copy Viserys' plan to capture the city, and even the famous second sons. Mero, the bastard of the Titans, was tall, with light green eyes and a thick, waist-length red gold beard. He was notorious, cruel, and tyrannical, so that the second sons rarely received commissions from employers under his command. This time, the remnants of the Pentos nobles found him, and Mero agreed immediately. He was not afraid of facing the elite soldiers of the Targaryen family. He only cared whether the little princess who could ride a dragon belonged to him. Mero wanted her to give birth to a son for him, so that his descendants could also have noble blood. The remnants of the nobles in Pentos heard his request, and agreed to it without hesitation. As long as he led the second sons to break through the protection of the eunuchs and capture Daenerys alive, he would reward him with the princess. Everything went well with the plan. The Tattered Prince discussed with the representatives of the families for several days. This time, the Tattered Prince learned his lesson, and placed his confidants around him to enforce martial law to ensure that the news would not be leaked. Now there are only 3,000 Unsullied and 3,000 city guards left in the city of Pentos. The Unsullied guard inside and outside the Nine Tower Palace, which is in the hands of Princess Daenerys, while the other 3,000 guards are in the hands of the Prime Minister Jon Connington. The last batch of troops to the expedition to Westeros has set off some time ago. It was the 2nd Legion led by Oberyn, with more than 15,000 men, who set out for Dragonstone with the pregnant future queen, Princess Irian Martell. They should have arrived by now. Although the number of troops in Pentos is still not small, it is still much less than the 50,000 at its peak. Now is the best time to retake Pentos. Their plan still fell on Daenerys. They planned to lure her out for patrol and suddenly attack her when she passed some narrow terrain. After capturing Dina is alive, her unsullied soldiers and dragons would be useless, no matter how powerful they were. The plan was perfect. Today was the time for the rebellion to begin. The ragged prince with grey hair and beard put on his armor again, and walked out of the prince's palace, and onto the street. The guards were preparing his horse. At this time, a vendor pushing a cart selling seafood clams passed by him, and suddenly took out a dagger from under the quilt, grabbed his shoulder, and stabbed him several times along the gap in the armor. Puff, puff, puff. The ragged prince opened his eyes wide, and tried to catch the other person, but he missed. The other person was very flexible, and ran away immediately after stabbing him. The street was filled with shrill screams. The soldiers of the city garrison patrolling not far away watched coldly. The ragged prince fell powerlessly in a pool of blood. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.